It was Christmas Eve when I drove up to my aunt's cabin. It had been a tradition for years that the family would gather there for the holidays, but this time I was staying alone. My aunt had gone on a trip with her friends, leaving me with the whole place to myself. I was actually looking forward to the solitude, though I had to admit, something about the quiet, snow-covered cabin gave me an uneasy feeling. The cabin sat alone in the woods, nestled deep in the mountains, far from any other houses. It was the kind of place you only visited during the holidays or the occasional summer vacation, and I hadn't been there since last winter. The snow was already deep on the ground when I arrived, and the air had that crisp, biting cold that makes your breath fog up in an instant. As I unloaded my bags, I took a moment to look around. The cabin was small but cozy, with a wide front porch that overlooked the frozen lake in the distance. The trees surrounding it were tall and thick, their bare branches reaching up like skeletal hands. The snow crunched underfoot, the silence almost overwhelming. There was no sound except the occasional creak of the trees as the wind gently blew through them. I made my way inside, the smell of pine wood instantly welcoming me. The inside of the cabin was warm and smelled like old, comforting things, with smoke, firewood, the faint scent of my aunt's cooking that always seemed to linger. The crackling fire in the living room stove added to the coziness, and I kicked off my boots, sinking into the couch. I was looking forward to just relaxing for the next couple of days. The wind outside picked up as nightfall came, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. The only sound inside was the crackle of the fire. I didn't even bother turning on the TV. I was content with the peace, the stillness of being alone in the cabin. But after a while, the silence started to feel heavier, like something was just a little off. I didn't feel unsafe exactly, but there was an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't quite shake. Maybe it was the storm that was starting to pick up or the isolation. I tried to distract myself by cooking dinner, but the whole time, my mind kept drifting to the window. Every time I looked outside, all I could see was a thick wall of white snow and dark shadows. Later, after dinner, I decided to take a walk. The storm had only intensified, but I was wrapped up warmly and figured a quick stroll around the cabin might do me good. I grabbed my coat and stepped out onto the porch, feeling the cold bite at my face. The snow crunched beneath my feet as I walked down the path that led through the trees toward the frozen lake. The woods around the cabin were dense, with towering pines that blocked out the little light the moon provided. It felt eerie, like the forest was swallowing up every sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. I made my way to the lake's edge and stood there for a few minutes, looking at the snow-covered surface. It was peaceful, yes, but it also felt like the kind of place where you could easily lose track of time or direction. I stayed for a while longer, just taking it all in, trying to convince myself I was being silly. When I finally turned back toward the cabin, the wind had picked up, and the snow was falling faster now. My footsteps seemed to get muffled by the growing storm. The darkness of the forest felt deeper now, and I found myself hurrying back toward the warmth of the cabin, suddenly feeling a sense of urgency I hadn't felt before. When I stepped back inside, I was relieved to hear the familiar crackling of the fire. The warmth hit me like a wave, and I quickly shed my wet clothes. I poured myself a drink, hoping it would settle my nerves, and tried to relax on the couch again. But the wind outside had grown louder. It sounded different now, almost like it was more than just wind. It was almost like something else. I couldn't quite explain it, but it made my skin crawl. Every few minutes, a particularly strong gust would shake the windows, and I'd hear a low, distant thud against the cabin walls. I told myself it was just the storm. The house was old, and the wind often did strange things. I tried to ignore it, but my mind kept drifting back to that feeling of being watched. At one point, I thought I heard something moving outside, a faint crunch in the snow. I stood up, walked to the window, and peered out into the night. The snow was coming down so thickly that I could barely see anything beyond the porch. I couldn't even see the tree line, just white, swirling snow. I let the curtains fall back into place and turned to walk away, but then I heard it again. A soft, crunching sound, closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. I stood there for a moment, straining my ears, listening. The wind howled, but underneath it, I could make out something else. Something rhythmic, like the sound of footsteps in the snow. I froze. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote, but there was no denying the feeling that someone human was out there. I slowly walked to the front door, trying not to make a sound. My hands were cold as I gripped the doorknob, and I hesitated for a moment before slowly opening the door. The cold hit me like a slap in the face, and the snow immediately started to fall into the cabin. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the area around the cabin. The snow had begun to cover the ground quickly, but I could still make out tracks, fresh, deep imprints in the snow that led right up to the porch. I immediately slammed the door behind me and bolted it shut. My breath was coming in short gasps, and my heart pounded in my chest. Who would be out here in the storm, in the middle of nowhere? The tracks weren't from an animal. They were too deliberate, too heavy. The next few minutes felt like hours. I paced around the cabin, checking every window, double-checking the locks. I didn't know what to do. My phone had no signal out here, and I was completely isolated. The cabin felt suddenly so much smaller, and the dark woods outside seemed to be closing in. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever had been outside was still out there. Finally, I decided to check the back door. I made my way down the hallway, careful not to make any noise. I slowly turned the doorknob, but the door wouldn't open. It had been frozen shut by the storm. I couldn't explain it. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Then, I heard it again, a sharp, scraping sound, like something dragging across the porch. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my coat, threw on my boots, and ran out the front door, past the snow-covered path leading to the trees. The air was freezing, but my heart was pounding in my chest, driving me forward. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the woods. The sound had stopped, and I could barely hear the wind over the pounding of my own heart. I stood there for a moment, gasping for breath, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. I stood there, watching the woods around me, until the snow began to slow and the wind died down. Slowly, cautiously, I walked back to the cabin, checking over my shoulder the entire way. When I finally reached the front door, I hesitated, but then I pushed it open. The cabin was just as I had left it, still and quiet, except for the low sound of the fire crackling. I bolted the door again and locked every window, just to be sure. That night, I didn't sleep. Every little noise made my heart race. I kept hearing things in the snow, footsteps, the scraping sound from before, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. I stayed awake until morning, watching the light slowly creep in through the windows. By then, the storm had passed, and the snow had settled. The next day, I checked the ground outside. The tracks were gone, completely vanished, as if they had never been there. I couldn't explain it, but I was relieved to know the danger was gone. The rest of my stay passed in quiet solitude, but I never let my guard down. I knew that something had been out there that night, something that had made me feel like I wasn't alone. But after a few days, I packed up and left, locking the door behind me. I never went back to that cabin alone. The cabin had always felt like my sanctuary, nestled in the woods, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. It was a place where I could finally breathe, escape from the noise of everyday life, and find some peace. It was an old wooden structure, but it had a certain charm. The creaky floorboards, the smell of pine and cedar, and the distant rustle of leaves outside all came together to create an atmosphere that felt timeless, untouched by the modern world. I had spent countless weekends there, but this trip was different. I decided to stay for a full week, hoping to clear my mind, do some reading, maybe even work on a few projects I'd been putting off for months. The drive up was long, but peaceful. The winding road eventually gave way to a dirt path leading deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around me as I drove, their branches reaching out like fingers, but I knew I was close. When I arrived, the cabin looked just as I remembered. The front porch was covered in vines, the windows were slightly fogged with the wear of time, and the chimney had a few marks of soot from past winters. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that's only found in places far removed from civilization. I unloaded my car, bringing in everything I thought I'd need for the week. It didn't take long to set up, and by mid-afternoon, I was inside, starting a fire in the wood stove to take the chill off. The cabin didn't have electricity, so the flickering light of the fire was the only illumination. As the shadows grew longer outside, I settled into an armchair by the stove, feeling content, if a little tired from the drive. The wood crackled, and I let my thoughts drift, the silence of the forest pressing in from every side. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I had gone to bed around midnight after reading for a while, the fire now reduced to a low glow. The night was cold, but the thick blankets kept me warm. I must have fallen asleep quickly, because I didn't remember waking up until I heard a sound. It wasn't the usual creak of the cabin settling, nor the wind against the walls. This was something more distinct, a sharp scraping sound from outside. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer moving through the underbrush. But then it came again, a slow, deliberate scrape. It sounded like something was being dragged along the ground, something heavy. I sat up in bed, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a tree branch scraping against the side of the cabin. Maybe the wind was stronger than I thought, causing the trees to sway more than usual. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I lay there in the dark, listening, waiting for the sound to stop. When it came again, closer this time, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just scraping anymore. It was like something was pacing around the cabin, moving back and forth. My heart started to race. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was probably just an animal. But the sound was too deliberate, too methodical, like whatever it was had a purpose. I got out of bed, creeping quietly to the window. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting pale light over the clearing. Everything looked normal. The trees swayed in the wind, the bushes rustled, but there was no sign of what was causing the sound. My breath felt shallow as I peered out into the night, trying to spot anything that seemed out of place. The wind howled through the trees, but that scraping sound didn't stop. I couldn't just sit there. I needed to know what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight and slipped on my boots. I didn't want to make too much noise, so I tried to be as quiet as possible as I opened the door and stepped outside. The cold hit me immediately, but I barely noticed. The scraping was louder now, closer to the back of the cabin. I walked cautiously around the side, my flashlight beam flickering as the wind kicked up. The gravel path was still and untouched, but as I rounded the corner, I froze. There, just a few feet away, something was moving in the shadows. I couldn't make it out clearly, but it looked like a figure hunched over, dragging something behind it. My heart thudded in my chest. I hadn't seen anyone in the area for days. I stepped back quickly, retreating toward the porch. My mind raced. What was it? Person? An animal? Something else? I didn't know, but the feeling in my gut told me it wasn't good. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I stayed in the cabin, the flashlight always within reach, peering out the windows every few minutes to make sure nothing was there. The scraping sound didn't return, but the unease lingered. The next day, I spent hours inspecting the cabin, looking for any signs of forced entry or damage. There was nothing. No footprints, no broken windows, no sign that anyone had been near the place. It was as if the night before hadn't happened at all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to convince myself that I had just been imagining things, that maybe the wind or a wild animal had caused the noises. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that whatever it was real, and it was still out there. The following nights passed in a tense silence. I kept the doors locked and the windows shut tight, not daring to venture outside after dark. The days were peaceful enough, just the sound of the wind and the rustling leaves. But every night, without fail, I would hear the scraping again. sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but it was always there, just beyond the cabin, in the dark woods. By the fourth night, I was losing sleep. The constant fear and anticipation were wearing me down. I didn't want to stay another night, but I also didn't want to leave. The cabin had been my escape, my place of peace, but now it felt like a trap. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. I decided to leave early the next morning. I packed my things quickly, not wanting to waste any more time. As I was about to load the last of my gear into the car, I heard the sound again. It was unmistakable, scraping, like something heavy dragging along the ground. This time, it was coming from the back of the cabin. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I glanced around the yard, looking for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line, watching me. It was too far to make out clearly, but I could feel its eyes on me. Without thinking, I ran to my car, jumped in, and slammed the door shut. My hands shook as I started the engine and peeled out of the driveway, not looking back. I didn't know what I had seen, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I kept driving, not stopping until I reached the nearest town, hours away from the cabin. When I finally pulled into a gas station, I sat in my car for a long time, trying to calm my racing heart. I couldn't explain what had happened at the cabin. Maybe it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind, but part of me knew it was something else. Something I couldn't see but could feel. Something that was waiting, just beyond the trees, in the dark. I never went back to the cabin. The thought of returning made my skin crawl, and though the noises stopped once I left, I sometimes still hear them in my dreams. The scraping, dragging sound, and the feeling that I'm not alone. I don't know what was out there, and I don't want to, but I learned something important that week. Some places are meant to be left alone, and sometimes it's better to walk away before you uncover whatever dark secret they're hiding. It was the middle of October when I decided to get away from everything. My job had been stressful, and I needed some peace, so I rented a small, secluded cabin in the woods. The cabin was tucked far away from the nearest town, about an hour's drive down winding dirt roads. No neighbors, no noise, just trees, hills, and solitude. Perfect. I'd been to places like this before, but something about this particular spot felt different, something almost off. Maybe it was the overgrown weeds creeping up around the porch or the way the cabin itself stood there, old and worn, like it had been forgotten by time. Still, I didn't pay much attention to it. The cabin had all the basics: an old fireplace, a few chairs, a small kitchen, and one bedroom upstairs. It wasn't luxurious, but it was what I needed. It wasn't the kind of place to inspire comfort, but I liked that. It felt real, raw, and just the kind of thing I was looking for to disconnect. The first night was quiet. I spent a few hours exploring the area around the cabin, wandering through the trees, breathing in the crisp autumn air, and checking out the small creek that ran about 100 yards away from the back of the cabin. It wasn't a large stream, but the sound of water running over rocks was calming. I noticed a few deer tracks near the water's edge, and I could hear birds calling from the trees. Nothing out of the ordinary. After dinner, I settled in, lighting the fireplace and putting my feet up on the coffee table with a good book. The night was still, and the only sounds came from the occasional crackling of the fire and the rustle of leaves outside as the wind picked up. It was the kind of silence that felt peaceful at first but gradually started to feel a little too quiet, like there was something lurking just beyond my vision, waiting to be noticed. I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I had been in isolated places before, but for some reason, this place was different. It was hard to put my finger on why exactly, but every time the wind howled through the trees, I found myself glancing nervously toward the windows, half expecting to see something or someone, standing just out of sight. I went to bed early that night, hoping that sleep would calm my nerves. The bed upstairs creaked as I lay down, and I pulled the blankets tight around me. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept racing. Every little creak and crack of the cabin sounded amplified, and every rustle in the trees outside seemed like something more than wind. I eventually drifted off, but it wasn't deep, restful sleep. It was fitful, interrupted by strange dreams and the feeling that someone was watching me. Around 3 a.m., I woke with a start. My heart was racing. I could hear something outside the window. It wasn't the wind this time. It was a soft, almost rhythmic thudding sound, like footsteps on the porch. Slowly, I sat up in bed, my body tense. I strained my ears, trying to make out what I was hearing, but the sound stopped abruptly, as if whatever it was had heard me move. I held my breath, trying to listen for any more noise, but the cabin was eerily still again. The only sound I could hear now was the thudding of my own heart. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I tried to calm myself, but the thought of an animal being that close to the cabin made my skin crawl. After a few minutes, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way downstairs as quietly as I could, my bare feet patting softly on the wood floor. The beam of my flashlight flickered for a second, and I cursed under my breath, tapping it against my palm to get it to work again. I opened the front door, careful not to make a sound, and stepped out onto the porch. The night was cold, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. The flashlight beam bounced around, revealing nothing but trees, the stillness of the night pressing in on me. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anything unusual. No animals, no figures lurking in the shadows. Nothing. Feeling foolish, I stood there for a moment, listening. The thudding sound had stopped, and everything seemed normal again. Maybe I had imagined it after all. I turned to go back inside when I noticed something strange. A small, irregularly shaped patch of dirt on the ground near the base of the porch. It looked like someone or something had been standing there. The earth was disturbed, and the edges were uneven, as if a heavy weight had been placed there recently. I bent down to get a closer look, but before I could fully examine it, a cold gust of wind blew through the trees, making me shiver. I decided it was time to go back inside, but as I turned toward the door, something caught my eye. Out of the corner of my vision, I saw a shape moving between the trees, fast, almost too fast for me to register. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, my flashlight darting toward the movement. But there was nothing there. I waited for a few moments, hoping to see it again, but the night was still. The only thing I could hear was the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I closed the door and locked it behind me, my pulse racing. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I decided to go back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak in the cabin made my stomach tighten, and every sound from outside seemed to carry more weight than it should have. It was like the world had gone quiet, and whatever had been out there was still watching me, waiting for the right moment. I eventually drifted off again, though it was far from restful. The night seemed to stretch on forever, each hour feeling like an eternity. The wind howled through the trees, and the occasional snap of a branch added to the tension. I kept imagining that I heard someone moving around the cabin, circling it like a predator looking for a weak spot. By the time the sun finally started to rise, I was exhausted. The light creeping in through the cracks in the window seemed like a relief. I quickly made myself a cup of coffee, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. The morning was crisp, with frost on the ground and the trees still holding onto the last remnants of autumn color. I went outside to gather some firewood and get some fresh air, hoping the daylight would clear my mind. As I walked toward the tree line, I noticed something odd. There, just at the edge of the woods, was a large rock with what appeared to be deep gouges in it. The marks were fresh, as if something had scraped against it recently. I bent down to inspect it, but before I could get too close, I heard a noise behind me. A soft crunch, like footsteps on the frosty ground. I spun around quickly, but there was nothing there, just the wind and the trees. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. The unsettling feeling from the night before returned with a vengeance. I was being watched again, and this time I wasn't imagining it. I could feel eyes on me from somewhere in the trees, hidden in the shadows. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I scanned the area, but I couldn't see anything. With my heart in my throat, I grabbed a few logs and hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me again. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the air had thickened and was pressing in on me. I decided then and there that I needed to leave. I wasn't sure what it was, whether it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or if something truly was out there, but I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, trying not to look out the windows too much. I didn't want to see anything moving out there. As I loaded my car, the unease in my chest didn't subside, even though the sun was now fully up and the day was bright. The drive out of the woods felt longer than it should have, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. When I finally reached the main road, I breathed a sigh of relief. The town was still a good distance away, but I felt safer with more people around. It wasn't until later, as I was going over my thoughts, that I realized something. There had been no animals around the cabin at all during my stay. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. The woods had been silent, unnaturally so, and that silence had been far more unsettling than anything I could have imagined. I don't know if I'll ever return to that cabin. Something about it felt wrong, like it was hiding a secret that I wasn't meant to uncover. I still think about it sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, and I can't help but wonder what was really out there, watching me. I sat on the porch of the cabin, the wood beneath me creaking slightly as I shifted my weight. The evening air was cool, though not cold enough to warrant a jacket. It was a quiet night, the kind that makes everything feel still. In the distance, the faint rustle of trees swaying in the breeze was the only sound that broke the silence. I wasn't really sure why I'd come out here alone. It wasn't that I hated company, but I just needed some time to clear my head. The cabin was small, one room with a loft and a porch that wrapped around the front. It sat on the edge of a forest, surrounded by miles of trees and brush. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine, a place he'd rented out to me for the weekend. It was tucked away, about 2 hours from the nearest town, and despite the charm it offered, I felt something off about it. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what, but it was like there was something lingering in the air, something subtle that I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the isolation. The closest neighbor was a mile away, and there was no sign of life around the cabin. Not a soul in sight, and that should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It felt like there was too much space between me and everything else. Too much distance between me and safety. I stood up and stretched, deciding to grab some firewood from the pile stacked near the side of the house. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the darkening sky had turned a deep blue. I'd made a small fire earlier in the evening, just to stave off the chill, and now it was burning low. The flames flickered and danced lazily as I placed the new logs onto the pile. As I turned to head back to the porch, I heard something, a noise coming from the woods. It wasn't anything distinct, just a faint crackle. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something moving through the underbrush, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded too deliberate, like someone was walking along the tree line, stepping slowly and carefully to avoid making noise. I froze. My heart rate picked up. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe a raccoon. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts racing through it. But something about the way the sound came, the way it stopped when I stopped, set me on edge. I tried to dismiss it, but I couldn't. Every few seconds, I'd hear a branch snap, and each time, it felt closer. I glanced over at the fire, then back at the trees. I didn't want to go investigate. I didn't want to find anything, but my feet had already started moving before I could think twice. I made my way toward the tree line, my shoes crunching over the dry leaves. The night was so still that even the smallest sound felt amplified. I could hear my breathing, the rustling of the leaves under my feet. The trees around me were dense, thick with branches that seemed to reach out like claws, casting long shadows in the dim light. I took a few steps deeper into the woods, squinting in the darkness, trying to make out any shapes or movements. Another snap. This time it was louder, closer. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I forced myself to keep going. Couldn't let fear take over. My flashlight flickered briefly as I swung it around, but it barely illuminated the dark stretch of forest before me. It felt as if the light was swallowed up by the trees. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A low growl. It wasn't a bear or anything that I could recognize. It sounded like something human, but wrong. Like someone was trying to sound like an animal, but they couldn't quite get it right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I immediately started backing up. My heart raced in my chest, and I had a fleeting thought to run, but something made me stay still. I waited in the dark, listening carefully. There was no movement, no sound except the rustle of leaves in the wind. The growl was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. I could feel the weight of the darkness around me, pressing in on all sides. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just a wild animal, maybe a coyote or a fox, but why had it sounded so off? Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was quick, a shadow darting between the trees. My stomach dropped. I turned my head to follow it, but there was nothing there, just the dark, empty woods. I took a few more cautious steps forward, my breathing shallow. I needed to know what it was. I had to know. I reached the clearing just beyond the trees, where the woods gave way to a small hill. The area was open, moonlight spilling over the ground, casting everything in a ghostly light. That's when I saw it. The figure. It wasn't a person. It was too tall, its limbs too long, crouched low to the ground, almost like it was hiding, watching. It was motionless, blending into the shadows, but the way it sat made my skin crawl. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off it. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, it shifted, its head slowly turning towards me. The movement was unnatural, too fluid, like something not quite human. The air grew colder, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't tell if it was trying to hide, or if it was waiting for me to make the first move. Finally, it stood up. Its height seemed to stretch impossibly, its body silhouetted against the dark sky. Took a step forward, and then another. My heart was pounding in my chest. Every instinct in me screamed to turn and flee, but my feet wouldn't cooperate. I couldn't stop looking at it. Its eyes, two dull, reflective points of light, were fixed on me. They weren't animal eyes. They were too intelligent, too human. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped moving. It froze, and for a moment, everything went completely still. The tension in the air was unbearable. My mind screamed for me to get out of there, to run as fast as I could, but my body remained paralyzed. And then, just as I was about to lose control, the figure turned around and walked into the woods, disappearing into the night. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the dark where it had been. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, but I couldn't. I didn't want to. I turned and ran back to the cabin, my heart still hammering in my chest. Every step felt like a lifetime as I pushed myself harder, faster, trying to escape the terror that had gripped me. I reached the porch and slammed the door behind me. The cabin was silent. Everything was still. I collapsed onto the couch, breathing heavily. My eyes darted around the room, half expecting to see something watching me through the windows. But there was nothing. Just the empty silence of the cabin. I sat there for a long time, unsure of what to do. It was late, but I didn't want to sleep. Couldn't. I felt like I was being watched, like there was something outside, just waiting for me to fall asleep so it could come for me. I stayed awake, watching the shadows, listening for any sound. Eventually, the hours passed, and I forced myself to sleep, though it was fitful and filled with strange dreams. In the morning, I woke up to the sun shining through the windows, the birds chirping outside. The forest seemed peaceful again, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The figure in the woods, the eyes. I packed up my things and left that morning, not looking back as I drove down the dirt road, away from the cabin and whatever was out there in the woods. I never told anyone what I'd seen. I don't know if they would have believed me anyway. But I'll never forget that feeling, the one that stayed with me long after I left. That feeling of being watched, of knowing something was out there, and that it was waiting for me to come back. I don't think I'll ever go back to that cabin. I had been at the cabin for about 3 days when I first noticed something strange. The cabin I'd rented for a few days was in a remote part of the forest, miles from any neighbors. It wasn't a fancy place, just a simple old wooden cabin that had seen better days. But that was what I liked about it. It felt secluded, peaceful, away from the noise and stress of the city. The kind of place where you could truly be alone. There were no cell signals out here, no distractions, just the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. It was perfect for a break. The first couple of days went by without incident. I spent most of my time outside, exploring the nearby trails, gathering wood for the fire, and just enjoying the silence. At night, the only sounds I could hear were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of animals in the woods. It was calm, serene, and exactly what I needed. But on the third night, things started to feel different. I was in the cabin, sitting by the fire, reading a book I'd brought along. The wind had picked up outside, making the trees creak and moan as they swayed. I hadn't seen a soul since I'd arrived, and the isolation started to feel heavier than usual. It wasn't that I was scared. It was just that the quiet had a way of pressing in on you after a while. I tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered, just on the edge of my thoughts. Around midnight, I decided to go outside for a quick walk. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was cool, the kind of chill you only get when you're deep in the woods at night. I pulled on my jacket and stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, the scent of pine sharp and fresh. I walked a little ways from the cabin, just far enough to get a good view of the stars. I'm not sure how long I stood there, just looking up, but when I turned back toward the cabin, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There, lying just outside the edge of the porch light's reach, was a shard of glass. It glinted faintly in the darkness, reflecting what little light there was. At first, I thought it was just a broken bottle or maybe a piece of old trash someone had left out here. But as I moved closer, I realized that this shard was no ordinary piece of glass. It was big, almost a foot long and jagged, the edges sharp like a knife. It didn't look like something that had just been thrown around or discarded. It looked deliberate. I bent down to get a closer look, feeling a strange chill crawl up my spine. There was no way it had come from inside the cabin. The windows were all intact, and I hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary since I'd arrived. But the glass was definitely fresh, not weathered like something that had been lying out for years. I stood there for a moment, debating what to do. I didn't feel in danger, at least not yet. But the unease I'd been feeling earlier was starting to creep back. I took a step back, still keeping my eyes on the shard of glass. As I moved, I noticed something else. There were footprints in the dirt, small, shallow ones, like someone had been walking around the cabin while I was inside. They were too faint to be from an animal, but not clear enough to be from a person wearing boots. They were just odd. I felt my stomach tighten. There was no one around, no cars, no sign of life for miles. But someone had been out here. I told myself it was probably nothing, just someone passing by or maybe a neighbor from the nearby cabin, though I knew there weren't many people out here. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the more I thought about it, the more my nerves began to rattle. I grabbed the shard of glass, not wanting to leave it lying there, and tossed it into the nearby woods, hoping it would be out of sight. Then, I made my way back inside, locked the door, and sat down in front of the fire. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but every time I heard a creak from the cabin or the wind howling through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. The rest of the night passed slowly, my mind racing. Every little sound seemed louder than usual, and I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone standing just outside. But there was nothing, just the darkness of the woods. The next morning, I woke up early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. I'd barely slept, the unease from the night before still gnawing at me. I decided to go out and check the area around the cabin, just to make sure there was nothing else out of place. When I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was the dirt around the porch had been disturbed. It wasn't much, just a few scuff marks and faint impressions in the ground, but they were enough to tell me that someone had been out here again. My heart raced as I looked around, scanning the woods. I didn't see anyone, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I walked around the cabin, checking the windows and the door. Everything seemed fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here recently. The strange footprints from the night before were gone now, but that didn't ease the tension in my chest. I spent the day trying to keep myself busy. I went for a hike in the woods, but I couldn't shake the sense of being followed. The trees seemed to close in on me, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. That night, I decided I wouldn't let it get to me. I go to bed early, lock up tight, and try to relax. But as I lay in bed, the sound of something scratching at the door broke the silence. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal looking for food. But the scratching didn't stop. It was steady, deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get inside. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced. Was it an animal? Had something gotten into the cabin? Or was it a person? I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, trying to secure the door. The scratching continued for a while, and I held my breath, listening for any other sounds. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, not daring to move, but there was no other sound, no footsteps, no creaks in the cabin. I stayed frozen, listening for any sign of movement. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a stray animal, maybe a raccoon or something similar. But my mind kept going back to the shard of glass I'd found the night before. What if someone had been out here, and that wasn't just some random piece of glass? What if it was meant for me? The next morning, I packed up my things and left the cabin, not wanting to spend another night in that eerie, quiet place. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin one last time, wondering who or what had been outside my door. And though I never found out the truth, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't coming back. The feeling of being watched, the unease that had plagued me the entire time, would stay with me long after I left. And that shard of glass would haunt me, its jagged edges a reminder that sometimes being alone isn't as peaceful as it seems. I had always dreamed of owning a cabin, tucked away somewhere remote, the kind of place where you could leave behind the chaos of life, step into a world of quiet, and forget about the everyday noise. When I finally found a cabin that seemed perfect, a little old place at the edge of the woods, I didn't hesitate. It was secluded, away from everything, and I could feel the peace just by standing on the property. The price was right too, so I bought it. The cabin itself was small, nothing fancy. It had rough-hewn logs for walls, a slanted roof covered in aged shingles, and a wide front porch that overlooked a sprawling field bordered by trees. The kind of place where you could just sit and listen to the wind in the leaves and the sounds of wildlife. The interior wasn't much, just the basics. A few rooms, a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a stone fireplace. The floorboards creaked when you walked across them. The walls were lined with old wooden beams, and the air smelled faintly of pine and dust. It was exactly what I had hoped for, a peaceful retreat to unwind from the world. I spent my first few days there alone, just enjoying the solitude. I unpacked my things, cleaned the place up a little, and made sure everything worked. The stove heated the place well enough, and the bed, though old, was comfortable. I spent a lot of time sitting outside, watching the sun set behind the trees, listening to the distant calls of birds and the rustling of the wind in the grass. I felt like I could finally breathe again. It wasn't until the fourth night that I started to feel uneasy. It was late, close to midnight, and I was sitting by the fireplace watching the flames crackle. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees, and the temperature had dropped. The cabin was warm enough, but there was a strange feeling in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't quite explain it, It wasn't anything overt, just a feeling that something wasn't right. I shook it off as being in my head and decided to head to bed. The next few nights were uneventful, but that feeling lingered. It was a vague sense of being watched, of something out there just beyond the trees, waiting. It was subtle, not enough to make me think something was seriously wrong, but it was there. The kind of feeling you get when you're alone in a place that's been empty for a while. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was adjusting to the isolation. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk through the woods behind the cabin. I grabbed my jacket and a bottle of water and set off along a narrow trail that wound its way through the trees. The woods were thick with pines, and the ground was soft with moss and fallen needles. The quiet of the forest was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional bird or squirrel. As I walked, I kept my eyes on the ground, watching for rocks or branches that might trip me up. The air smelled fresh, earthy, like damp leaves and pine sap. I was starting to feel better, like maybe I had just been overthinking things. That was when I saw it. A small patch of disturbed earth, just off the trail. It didn't look natural, the way the dirt was scattered around. Something had definitely been digging there. I crouched down, inspecting it closely. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a small shovel, but it was fresh, the dirt still loose and soft. There were no tracks around it, no sign of anything that had caused the disturbance, just the hole and the scattered earth. I stood there for a minute trying to make sense of it. It didn't look like an animal had done it. It wasn't the right kind of digging, felt wrong, out of place. I shrugged it off and kept walking, but the sense of unease crept back in. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching me from between the trees. The forest felt thicker, darker, more oppressive. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. There were plenty of animals in these woods, things like coyotes, foxes, maybe even bears. That was all. When I got back to the cabin, I tried to focus on other things. Stoking the fire, making a quick dinner, unpacking more of my stuff. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The evening was quiet, but the shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to grow longer, darker. I kept hearing little noises that didn't quite make sense. The floorboards creaking, a faint tapping on the window, the sound of something moving outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but after a while, I wasn't so sure. That night, I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was soft at first, just a rustling, but then it grew louder, like something moving outside the cabin. I lay still, trying to listen. The sound was coming from the front porch. It wasn't the wind, not the usual creaking of the old boards. This was different, like something or someone was out there. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, a deer or a raccoon, messing around. But the sound didn't stop. It was too deliberate, too persistent. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly got out of bed, trying not to make any noise. My heart was pounding in my chest as I slowly made my way to the door. I stood there for a long moment, listening. The rustling was still there, right outside, like something was pacing the porch. I could hear its movements shifting, the scrape of claws on wood. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to open the door, to shine the light out onto the porch, but something held me back. What if it was a person, or something worse? I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the flashlight in my hand shaking, my mind racing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Silence. I waited, straining to hear any sign of movement, but there was nothing. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. After a while, I felt my body relax, just a little. Could have been an animal, I told myself. It was probably just an animal. But I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the wind outside made me jump. My mind kept racing, thinking of what could have been out there, just beyond the door. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, I finally allowed myself to relax, even though the unease still lingered. Over the next few days, I tried to act like nothing had happened. I spent my time cleaning, organizing, fixing little things around the cabin. But the feeling of being watched never went away. It was like the woods were closing in around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for me out there. I kept my distance from the woods, staying close to the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was just getting used to being alone in a place like this. Then one evening, as I sat on the porch, I saw something. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure moving through the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. It wasn't large, but it was too big to be an animal, and it was moving deliberately, like it knew I was watching. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, staring at the spot, but by the time I turned my head to look more closely, the figure was gone. Just like that. The next day, I packed my things. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't safe here anymore. I had come looking for peace, but instead, I felt like I was being hunted, like the woods had decided they didn't want me here. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation, the silence getting to me. Or maybe there was something out there, something I couldn't see, but I knew I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I left the cabin and never went back. The cabin still stands there, in the woods, empty and forgotten, waiting for the next person to take a chance on it. Maybe they'll find peace there, or maybe they'll feel the same uneasy presence that I did. All I know is that for me, the dream of owning a cabin in the woods was over. It wasn't the escape I thought it would be, and it certainly wasn't the peaceful retreat I had imagined. It was something else, something darker, something I didn't understand, and maybe, just maybe, I was better off leaving it behind. I settled into the cabin late one Friday evening, the wood of the porch creaking underfoot as I stepped inside. It was one of those places where time slowed down. No distractions, no neighbors, just the trees, the mountain air, and me. It wasn't luxurious, just a simple, one-room cabin tucked away in the woods. The walls were made of dark, rough-hewn logs that looked aged but solid. A stone fireplace sat in one corner, with a few worn chairs around it. The place was warm, comfortable, but it felt isolated. It wasn't far from the nearest town, but it felt like a different world once you got out here. I had visited a few times before, but this time I was here alone. The first night went by uneventfully. I unpacked my things, stoked the fire, and settled into one of the chairs with a book. The stillness of the cabin was only broken by the occasional crackling of the fire or the howling of the wind outside. The place had an odd comfort to it. It was quiet, in a way that made you feel like you were the only one left in the world. But as the night wore on, I began to feel the weight of the silence, the kind that presses in on you when you're alone in a place that doesn't see many visitors. My mind started to wander. I'd heard stories, about people getting lost in the woods, about things moving around at night. It was easy to dismiss those stories in the daylight, but now, alone in the cabin, I started to wonder if they might not have been just stories after all. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something outside, a faint rustling, like the crunch of leaves underfoot. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon. But then, I heard it again, closer this time, like something was circling the cabin. I couldn't tell exactly where it was coming from, but it didn't sound like a normal animal. I've spent enough time in the woods to know what a deer or a squirrel sounds like when they're moving around. This didn't match. I grabbed the flashlight from the table, shining it through the small window, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever might be out there. Nothing. The light bounced off the trees, their shadows long and jagged in the beam. The wind had picked up, and the leaves rustled in a way that almost sounded like whispers. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or something else. But the more I thought about it, the more I started to feel uneasy. I turned off the light, listening carefully, but all I could hear was the wind now. It wasn't enough to settle my nerves, though. The cabin felt different all of a sudden, like it wasn't just my space anymore, like there was something else here with me. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were no signs of anything unusual, no tracks in the dirt or broken branches, just the usual mess of the woods around the place. I convinced myself that it had been nothing, just the normal noises of wildlife. Still, The nagging feeling lingered, even as I made my coffee and sat down to eat breakfast. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation was getting to me. I decided to take a walk around the property to clear my head. The walk did little to ease my nerves. The woods were dense, the trees towering overhead, their limbs creaking in the wind. As I walked deeper into the forest, I noticed something strange. The ground was too quiet. No birds, no small animals darting between the trees. Nothing. It felt off. The usual sounds of the forest were absent. The wind, which had been rustling the leaves when I first set out, had died down completely. I kept walking, trying to ignore the strange feeling creeping up my spine. After a while, I turned around to head back to the cabin. That's when I noticed it, a figure standing between the trees, just beyond the edge of where the sunlight broke through the canopy. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but when I blinked, the figure was still there. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could see the shape of it clearly, tall, unmoving. It looked like a person, standing still, just watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I knew no one else was supposed to be out here. There were no other cabins within miles, and I hadn't seen anyone on my way in. I froze, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't move, just stood there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something. Waiting for me. I didn't take my eyes off it. Slowly, I backed away, walking backward, keeping the figure in sight. The woods felt suddenly too wide, too open, like the trees had begun to close in on me. When I finally turned and started to walk briskly back to the cabin, I didn't look back. I kept my eyes straight ahead, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. I didn't want to entertain the idea that someone was out here, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I didn't go back outside for the rest of the day. The idea of leaving the cabin, of being out in the woods alone with that figure watching, felt wrong. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, maybe a hunter or a camper passing through. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I'd seen something and it wasn't normal. Night came again, and with it, the same silence. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, but it felt like the night was heavier this time, like the weight of it was pressing down on me. The fire in the hearth crackled, and I kept the light low, not wanting to draw attention to the cabin. The last thing I wanted was for whoever or whatever was out there to know where I was. I sat there, feeling the minutes tick by, listening to the silence. Then, just as I thought I might drift off to sleep, I heard it again. That rustling. It wasn't just the wind this time. It was deliberate. Slow, soft footsteps moving around the cabin. My pulse raced. My mind screamed at me to move, to grab something, but I couldn't bring myself to do anything. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and methodical, as if whoever was out there knew exactly where I was. Then, just as quickly as they had started, they stopped. The silence returned, and this time it was absolute. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I spent the hours by the fire, watching the shadows in the cabin shift with the flickering light. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of the wind outside made my heart leap into my throat. The sun didn't rise fast enough. The next morning, I packed up my things. I didn't want to be here anymore. I didn't care what it was that had been out there, or if I was just being paranoid. It wasn't worth it. I didn't even want to wait until the afternoon. I just needed to leave. As I gathered my stuff, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Still waiting out there, just beyond the trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I forced myself to focus. I wasn't going to stay another night, and I wasn't going to look back. I loaded up my truck and started the engine, the sound of it breaking the silence that had settled over the cabin. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, watching me leave. But the cabin remained empty. The woods were quiet again. I drove away, and as the miles stretched between me and the cabin, the uneasy feeling started to fade. By the time I reached the town, I was almost convinced that it had all been in my head. Maybe I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew the truth. There had been something out there, and I'd be damned if I ever came back to find out what it was. The cabin is still there, hidden away in the woods. I drive past it sometimes, but I never stop. I've never gone back. I don't think I ever will. I don't need to know what was out there. The mystery is better left unsolved. I had been looking forward to the weekend for weeks. After working a steady routine of 9-hour days, I was eager for a break from the noise and clutter of the city. A cabin in the woods, far from civilization, seemed like the perfect escape. The plan was simple: drive up, relax, maybe do a little hiking, and just take in the quiet. No phones, no distractions. Just me, the forest, and some solitude. The cabin was located about 3 hours north, nestled deep in the woods where the nearest neighbor was miles away. The kind of place where you don't worry about noise, because there's nothing to hear but the wind and the occasional bird. I had rented it online, and the listing described it as rustic, nothing fancy but charming in its own way. When I arrived, I wasn't disappointed. It was a small, wooden structure with a steep roof and large windows that let in the view of the trees surrounding it. The only real sign of civilization nearby was a narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, which was only barely visible from the main highway. Once you turned off that road, you were in the heart of the woods. I pulled my car into the small gravel driveway and shut the engine off. The silence hit me immediately. Not the quiet that you might get in a suburban neighborhood late at night, but a deep, profound silence, like the world itself had taken a breath and paused. The air was thick with the smell of pine, and the coolness of the late autumn afternoon wrapped around me. I grabbed my bag from the trunk, closed the car door, and walked up to the porch. The cabin's wooden steps creaked underfoot, and as I stepped inside, I was greeted with the scent of aged wood and dust. The interior was cozy, with a stone fireplace, mismatched chairs, and an old wooden dining table. It felt like it had been abandoned for a while, but in a way that added to its charm. There was a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a narrow staircase leading up to a loft where the bedroom was. I tossed my bag on the bed and opened the window to let some fresh air in. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves outside, and I could hear the occasional crack of a branch snapping under the pressure. Felt peaceful, safe. The first night, I didn't do much. I started a fire in the fireplace and spent the evening sitting in front of it, reading a book. The flames crackled, and the shadows from the fire danced on the walls. I ate some simple food, just sandwiches, and enjoyed the solitude. Around midnight, I blew out the candles and went to bed. The bed was soft, the air outside was cold, and the warmth from the fire kept me comfortable under the thick covers. I must have drifted off quickly because when I woke, it was already late the next morning. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. It was quiet, but not the kind of quiet I had woken up to the night before. The air felt different now, heavier, more pressing. I got up, stretched, and opened the window to let the fresh air in. It was still early, but I decided to go for a walk. I laced up my boots and grabbed my jacket, walking out onto the porch. The world outside seemed even quieter in the early morning, the only sounds being the rustle of the trees and the occasional bird call. The forest stretched out around me, dense and sprawling. I followed a small trail that led deeper into the woods, not really knowing where it went but content to just wander. For hours, I walked through the forest. The path twisted and turned, leading me through thickets of trees, over fallen logs, and across small streams. It was peaceful, but there was an odd feeling that I couldn't quite shake, like I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd hear a sound, footsteps perhaps, off in the distance, but when I turned to look, I'd see nothing. Maybe it was just the wind. After all, this was the woods, and the wind could do strange things. But the feeling stuck with me. I headed back to the cabin by early afternoon, feeling a little uneasy but brushing it off. I told myself it was just my imagination. I put my boots by the door and made myself a quick lunch. The afternoon passed slowly as I sat by the window, watching the forest, my thoughts drifting in and out like the clouds above. I had no particular plans. I figured I would read more or maybe take a nap. The place was perfect for doing nothing. But as evening drew closer, things started to get odd. The light outside dimmed, and the air became still, unnaturally still. The wind had completely died down, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the cabin's wooden frame as it settled. I glanced outside, and that's when I saw it. A figure, a person standing at the edge of the tree line. I froze. At first, I thought it was another hiker, someone else who had gotten lost and stumbled upon the cabin. But something about the way the person stood, motionless, just didn't sit right. Couldn't make out any details. The figure was too far away, just a silhouette against the darkening woods. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my mind racing, trying to figure out what I was looking at. Then, without warning, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. I stood there for what felt like forever, heart racing in my chest. I hadn't heard any footsteps, no crunch of leaves, nothing. It was as though the person had simply vanished into thin air. I didn't know what to do. Should I go out and check? What if it was someone who needed help? But then again, why had they disappeared so suddenly? I decided to wait a while, hoping the figure might reappear. But as night fell, it became clear that the figure wasn't coming back. The feeling of unease continued to grow, but I tried to push it aside. I convinced myself it was just some weird thing I had imagined. By the time I went to bed, the forest outside was completely silent. The cabin felt eerily still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I woke up sometime during the night, not sure why. The air felt thicker now, colder, and the silence was suffocating. I glanced around the room. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, stretching across the floor. For a moment, I thought I saw something move just outside the window, but when I blinked, it was gone. I lay in bed for what felt like an eternity, listening to the silence and watching the shadows. My mind raced with thoughts of the figure from earlier, and then it hit me: there were no animals, no birds, no wind. It was as though the entire forest had fallen completely silent. A loud crash from downstairs broke the stillness, making me jump out of bed in a panic. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. It was loud, unmistakable, a heavy object falling to the floor. I didn't even think, just grabbed my flashlight and crept down the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The living room was dark, except for the faint light from the flashlight. I scanned the room, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. No broken furniture, no windows open, nothing. But then, I noticed it: footprints. Large, muddy footprints, leading from the back door and across the floor. I stepped closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The footprints were fresh, the mud still wet from the outside. Whoever had made them was close, too close. I grabbed the nearest thing to defend myself, an old metal poker from the fireplace, and walked toward the door. I checked the locks, making sure everything was secure. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger now, and it sent a chill down my spine. I spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair near the fireplace, the poker in hand, my eyes darting to every sound, every movement. I didn't dare close my eyes. In the morning, I checked outside. The footprints led toward the woods but stopped just at the tree line. No sign of anyone, no further disturbance. I couldn't explain what had happened, but the uneasy feeling never left. I packed my things and left that afternoon. As I drove back down the dirt road, I glanced at the cabin in my rearview mirror. The woods were silent again, just as they had been when I first arrived. But this time, the silence felt different, darker, heavier. I had come for peace and solitude, but what I found was something else entirely. I've never gone back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. I was staying at my dad's cabin, alone. He had asked me to look after the place while he was away on a business trip. It wasn't unusual for me to spend some time up there by myself, but something about that particular evening felt different. I couldn't quite place it. I had always loved the isolation of the cabin, the silence that surrounded it. Nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, it was the kind of place where the only sounds were those of nature. The wind rustling the trees, the occasional chirp of crickets, and the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful, quiet, and safe, or so I thought. The evening had started like any other. I made dinner, sat by the fireplace, and enjoyed the warmth as the fire crackled. The sun had long since set, and the darkness of the woods had begun to press in, like it always did when nightfall came. The cabin had no electricity, so the only light came from the flickering flames in the fire. It was quiet just the way I liked it. But as the hours passed, I started to feel uneasy. The kind of uneasy where every little noise stands out. Every creak of the cabin's wooden floorboards, every shift of the wind outside. I chalked it up to just being alone, far away from anyone else. There's something about being isolated in a place like this that can start to play tricks on your mind. Around 11 p.m., I heard something that made my stomach drop. A faint sound, barely noticeable at first. It was a thud like a heavy footstep. I stopped what I was doing and listened intently. Nothing, just the wind and the occasional crack of the fire. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably just an animal outside. It wasn't uncommon to hear animals moving around in the woods at night, but this felt different. The thud wasn't natural. It wasn't the scurrying of small feet or the rustling of leaves. This was something heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I got up from my chair, moving cautiously toward the window. I peered out through the blinds, trying to see what was outside. The moonlight barely lit the area around the cabin, casting long, jagged shadows. There was nothing there, nothing but the trees swaying in the breeze. Still, I couldn't help but feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I decided to go outside and check the surroundings. Maybe a branch had fallen, or something had disturbed the underbrush. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter, slipping my boots on. Stepping outside onto the porch, I felt the cool night air hit my face. The cabin sat on a small hill, surrounded by dense forest. The porch light above me cast a faint glow, but beyond that, it was just darkness. I walked down the small set of stairs, my boots crunching softly on the gravel path. The flashlight beam swept across the area, illuminating the ground and trees. There was nothing out of the ordinary, but still the feeling of unease gnawed at me. I started to walk further down the path, shining the light back and forth, trying to catch any movement in the shadows. Then I saw it. In the distance, near the tree line, there was a figure standing still, holding something. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was a man, tall and broad, his face obscured by the darkness. But it was the object he was holding that made my blood run cold. An axe. I froze in place, my body tensing. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the cabin. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at him. Maybe it was seconds, or maybe it was minutes. Either way, I knew I had to get back inside. My mind raced. What was he doing out there? Why was he standing in the woods with an axe? I took a slow step backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea who he was or what he wanted, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I turned and sprinted back to the cabin, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just seen. Who was that man? Was he someone from the area? Had I somehow disturbed him by being here alone? I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it as quickly as I could. I moved to the phone on the counter, my hands shaking as I picked it up. I dialed 911, my heart still hammering in my chest. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice came through, calm but firm. There's someone outside my dad's cabin. I think they're holding an axe. I don't know who they are or what they want. My voice was shaky, but I tried to stay as calm as possible. Please send someone. The dispatcher asked for my location and assured me that help was on the way. I hung up, but the fear didn't subside. I couldn't just wait around for the police to show up. I had no idea if the man was still out there or if he was moving closer. I grabbed the phone again and dialed my dad's number. I didn't know what I expected him to do, but I needed someone to talk to, someone to help calm my nerves. There was no answer. I turned off the lights in the cabin and moved to the small window near the door. The flashlight I had used earlier was still out there, lying on the ground where I had dropped it in my rush to get inside. I couldn't see anything in the dark, just the shadows of the trees. I was too afraid to step back outside, but I couldn't stay locked in forever. I kept the phone with me, holding it tight in my hand. I didn't know if the man had seen me or if he was still out there waiting. The longer I sat there, the more my mind raced. I kept hearing noises, the rustling of the trees, the creak of the cabin. It felt like every little sound was amplified, like the woods were closing in on me. My thoughts went wild, imagining every worst-case scenario. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the sound of a vehicle in the distance, the unmistakable sound of sirens. The police had arrived. I rushed to the window again, my heart pounding in my chest. The headlights of a squad car cut through the darkness, followed by the flashing blue and red lights. The car slowed as it neared the cabin, and I saw the figures of 2 officers stepping out, their flashlights cutting through the night. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching the officers move toward the woods. I knew they would find him. He couldn't have gone far. I hoped they would catch him. I didn't want to think about what might happen if they didn't. Minutes later, the sound of footsteps outside made me tense up. The police were getting closer. Then I heard a shout, a voice calling out to the man in the woods. A few more shouts followed, and then the unmistakable sound of the man being apprehended. The police had him. It wasn't long before the officers returned, leading the man, still holding the axe, back toward the squad car. He didn't resist, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved. He was calm, almost too calm, as if he had done this before. I watched from the window as they loaded him into the back of the car and drove off. The lights from the police cars slowly faded into the distance, and the woods around me seemed to return to their quiet state. The tension in my chest loosened, but the fear didn't completely fade. I had been scared for my life, scared of the unknown. Eventually, I sat down on the couch, exhausted. The adrenaline from the whole ordeal was wearing off, and I could feel the weight of it all. The fear, the relief, the realization that something dangerous had been just outside my door. When my dad called later, I told him everything. He was concerned but grateful that I had called the police and stayed safe. As for the man, I found out the next day that he had a history of strange behavior and had been living off the grid for months. The police didn't know exactly why he was there, but they suspected he was looking for something or someone. I didn't know what could have happened if I hadn't called the police, but I was glad I didn't have to find out. The hike started out as something simple. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any form of civilization, just the woods and the sound of my boots crunching on the forest floor. It had been a long day, the kind where you get lost in the rhythm of walking, the swaying of the trees, and the smell of pine in the air. The sun was starting to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the uneven trail. I wasn't worried about being out here. I had the supplies and knew how to handle the woods, but as the light began to fade, something about the silence started to settle differently in my gut. I had been following a narrow path, one I'd picked out from the trail maps, something that promised a nice view up ahead. The trail had twisted and turned, weaving through thick clusters of trees and patches of overgrown brush. The further I went, the more the air felt dense, heavy with the scent of earth and leaves. There wasn't much noise, no chirping birds or distant animal calls, just the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the treetops. I stopped to drink from my water bottle, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. I could feel my legs starting to ache from the long stretch of the hike, and I figured it was a good time to rest for a bit. I looked around, trying to gauge my location on the map, but it wasn't clear if I was close to where the trail opened up or if I'd missed a turn somewhere. I couldn't hear any signs of civilization, no cars or distant voices. It was the kind of silence that felt a little too quiet, if you know what I mean. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just an illusion, a trick of the light maybe, a patch of forest that looked like something more, something unnatural. But as I squinted into the trees, I realized there was no mistake. Through the gaps in the underbrush, I could make out the dark shape of what looked like a cabin. A small cabin, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, almost camouflaged by the dense woods surrounding it. I took a step closer, not sure if I should even approach it. A cabin out here? That didn't make any sense. Who would build a place like that this far out in the woods? I'd never heard of any private cabins in this part of the forest, at least not on the maps I'd studied. My curiosity, though, got the better of me. I had to see it for myself. I left the trail, stepping off the path and crunching through the brush, careful not to trip over the undergrowth. The cabin wasn't very far off, maybe 50 yards or so. The closer I got, the more details I could make out. The wood of the cabin was dark, stained by age and weather, but it still stood strong. The roof had patches of moss growing on it, and there were wooden shutters over the windows, a few of them hanging loosely as though they hadn't been cared for in years. There was a small porch with a single rocking chair sitting idle on it, and a small set of stairs that led up to the front door. I couldn't help but feel a slight chill, even with the warmth of the day still hanging in the air. It was odd. The cabin wasn't old in a way that felt historical, more like it had been abandoned recently. The kind of place you would find if you stumbled upon someone's hideaway, but they had left in a hurry. No signs of life, no smoke coming from a chimney, no sounds from inside, just silence. I walked around the outside of the cabin, looking for a way in, though I wasn't sure what I expected to find. The door was shut tight, and there wasn't any obvious way to open it. But as I walked around the back, I saw a small window near the ground. Its glass cracked, but still mostly intact. The window was unlocked, and it gave slightly when I pushed on it. I hesitated. It was a stupid move. I knew that, but I was too curious to walk away now. So, I pushed the window up carefully, making sure it didn't make too much noise, and slipped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't damp, like I'd expected from an abandoned place. It smelled more like dust, old wood, and a hint of something metallic. The interior was dim, lit only by the fading light coming in from the cracks in the walls. The room was small, with a fireplace against one wall, the remnants of a fire still in the hearth. A few old chairs were scattered around the room, the cushions worn down and threadbare. A small table sat in the center, with a few scraps of paper scattered across it. There was nothing out of place at first glance, but there was a sense of stillness, of time having stopped here. It felt like whoever had been living in this cabin had just up and left one day. No warning, no sign. I walked further into the cabin, my footsteps echoing a bit too loudly in the quiet. The air felt heavier now, almost suffocating. As I stepped into what looked like a small bedroom, I noticed the bed was made, the sheets still crisp. The dresser was bare, and there was a pile of what looked like old clothes in the corner. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe a clue, some kind of sign that would explain what had happened here. But all I found were small details that only raised more questions. A broken chair with the seat ripped out, a dusty book on the floor, pages curled from age. Then I saw something odd. On the floor near the corner of the room, tucked away behind the bed, was a small wooden box. It was partially hidden, like it had been shoved out of sight. My first instinct was to leave it alone, but again, curiosity pulled me closer. I reached down and carefully pulled it out, brushing the dust off of it. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and there was something about the way it felt in my hands that made my heart skip a beat. I opened the box slowly. Inside, there were a few things, old photographs, some faded and curled at the edges. I picked one up, holding it to the light. It was a photo of a man and a woman standing together in front of a cabin. But it wasn't this cabin. It was newer, more modern. There was a fire pit in the background, and the trees looked different, less overgrown. The woman in the photo looked familiar. I couldn't place it, but something about her face seemed off. It wasn't anything specific, but a vague feeling of discomfort washed over me. I flipped through the rest of the photos, all taken in various places that seemed connected to the cabin in some way, but none of them made sense to me. I didn't know who these people were, and yet there was an odd familiarity in the way they were positioned in the pictures. I closed the box, my mind racing. I didn't want to stick around any longer. Something about the place felt wrong, like it wasn't just abandoned, it was forgotten, and not in a way that felt natural. I quickly made my way back to the window, slipping out the same way I came in. I stood there for a moment, staring at the cabin, trying to make sense of what I just discovered. The silence of the forest around me felt oppressive now, like it was closing in. I didn't want to linger any longer. I grabbed my pack, checked my map, and started heading back to the trail. It took me a while to make it back to the main path, my legs aching, my mind still processing everything. The woods didn't feel as peaceful anymore. It felt as though I had intruded on something, uncovered something I wasn't supposed to. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, I breathed a sigh of relief. I didn't look back. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that cabin, but part of me doesn't want to. It's like some places are meant to be left alone, and some things are better off staying hidden. I never found out who lived in that cabin or why they left. I don't know if I'll ever understand what I stumbled upon that day. But I do know this: there are some places in the woods that shouldn't be found, and I'm okay with leaving that one behind. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Something was wrong. It was the quiet. A deep, eerie silence hung in the air. I couldn't hear the usual nighttime sounds: the rustling of the wind in the trees, the croak of a frog by the creek, the chirp of crickets. It was as if the whole forest had gone still, waiting. I sat up in bed, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the cabin window. The old wooden walls creaked as the house settled, but there was something else. A sound, faint but unmistakable. The scraping of claws against wood. It was slow, methodical, as if whatever was making the sound knew exactly how to go unnoticed at first, how to lull you into a false sense of security. The night had started like any other. I'd rented the cabin out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods, for some solitude. It had been peaceful for the first couple of days. Nothing but the sound of the wind, the occasional deer, and the rustling of leaves. Perfect for what I needed. But now, as the silence stretched on, I felt the unmistakable pull of unease. I stood up, quietly trying not to make a sound. My boots thudded softly on the floorboards as I made my way to the window, peeking out through the blinds. There was nothing unusual out there, just the dark shadows of the trees stretching far beyond what the dim light could reach. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise, but I couldn't tell why. I had always been a little paranoid when it came to being alone in the woods. My thoughts began to wander, and I tried to brush them off as nothing. This cabin was supposed to be a retreat, nothing more. Then the noise came again, this time louder. It was closer, more distinct. The scraping of claws, followed by the soft, rhythmic tapping of something heavy against the ground. My mind raced, trying to piece together what it could be. Maybe a large animal, deer, maybe even a bear. But this wasn't the sound of a bear. Bears don't walk on two legs. I crept quietly over to the door, careful not to make a sound. I had locked it earlier, but I wasn't sure that would do me any good if something wanted to get in. I grabbed a flashlight from the table by the door, clicked it on, and opened the door just a crack. I peered out into the night, my breath caught in my throat. There, standing just outside the porch light's faint glow, was something I couldn't explain. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. Its silhouette was dark and massive, with broad shoulders and long limbs. Its head was angled just right, as if it was studying me. At first, I thought it was some kind of distorted shadow or trick of the light, but when it moved, I saw it clearly. The creature was hunched, its back slightly arched, but the way it moved, like something from a nightmare, sent a cold wave down my spine. The worst part was its eyes. They glowed, a faint yellowish green, piercing through the dark, and they were fixed on me. I felt the fear take root in my chest, heavy and cold, as I stood frozen. The creature's body was covered in dark fur, matted and thick. Its face was partially hidden in the shadows, but I could make out the shape of its muzzle, elongated with sharp, pointed teeth visible even from a distance. I was sure it was looking straight at me. My heart beat so loud in my chest, I was sure it would hear it. But as I stood there, not daring to move, the creature suddenly shifted, stepping back a few paces, still watching. I didn't wait to find out what it was going to do next. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so much I could barely get the key in the lock. I backed away from the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. It was a dog, but not a dog. It was something more, a twisted version of a creature that shouldn't exist. It didn't fit any description I knew, and I had no idea what it was or why it was out there. I stayed near the door, listening, waiting for the sound to return. I could hear it now, that heavy breathing, that low, guttural sound coming from just beyond the porch. It sounded almost human, almost like it was trying to mimic something, but not quite right. There was something wrong about it, something off that made my skin crawl. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I don't know. Time had started to feel strange. I checked the windows, the door, the locks, but I knew in my gut that none of it would matter if whatever was outside decided to get inside. I should have left, I should have called for help, but there was nothing out here. No one for miles. I was alone in the woods, trapped in this old cabin with something that should not exist. The night stretched on, the silence broken only by the occasional scrape of claws against the wood or the sound of something heavy dragging against the earth. It circled the cabin, its movements slow, deliberate. I could hear it sniffing, like it was searching for something or someone. I didn't know what to do. The flashlight's beam flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls as I paced nervously. I considered bolting out the back door, but what if it was out there, waiting for me? What if it wanted me to come out? I wasn't stupid enough to fall for that. As the hours passed, I grew more and more paranoid. The creature was still out there, and I knew it hadn't given up. I could hear it scratching, sniffing, pacing around the cabin like it was looking for a weakness. I couldn't escape, couldn't call for help. Then, just as I was starting to lose hope, I heard the sound of a truck in the distance. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, and I realized it was getting closer. My heart leapt at the thought of someone, anyone, coming to rescue me. I rushed to the window, hoping to see headlights, anything to tell me I wasn't alone anymore. I looked outside, and there it was, a truck pulling up to the cabin. I watched, frozen, as the headlights illuminated the trees and the ground. The truck stopped just in front of the porch, and I heard the engine shut off. But then, something strange happened. The creature, the thing that had been circling the cabin all night, suddenly froze. It turned and looked directly at the truck, its glowing eyes locked on the vehicle. I could see its muscles tense, and for a moment it almost seemed to be waiting. The truck door opened, and a figure stepped out. I couldn't see who it was, but I saw them glance around, confused. They walked toward the cabin, but as they reached the steps, they stopped short. The creature was still there, standing motionless just beyond the light. Then, in one smooth, terrifying motion, the creature lunged. I heard a bone-chilling growl, followed by the sound of the truck door slamming shut. I couldn't watch anymore. I ran to the back door, threw it open, and bolted into the woods. My mind was screaming, but my legs were moving faster than I had ever run in my life. I didn't look back, not once. As I ran through the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. Hours later, when I finally stumbled out of the woods and into a nearby town, I collapsed. I couldn't remember much of what had happened, except the feeling of being hunted. I don't know who the person in the truck was, or if they made it out alive. All I know is that I'll never go back to that cabin, and I'll never forget the eyes of the creature that waited for me in the darkness. The forest is full of things you don't understand, things you'll never see unless you're unlucky enough to come across them. But for now, I'm safe. That's all that matters, and I'll make sure no one else ever goes looking for that cabin. Some things are best left alone. It was a few years ago when I first set up my cabin. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small structure tucked away in the woods. I built it myself, or at least with the help of a few friends here and there. It wasn't too far from the old hunting grounds I frequented, but far enough that you couldn't hear the hum of any towns or roads. When I'd planned it, I wanted a place to escape, somewhere I could go when I needed to clear my head, or when hunting season rolled around. The cabin was simple. It had just one room, a loft for sleeping, a wood-burning stove, and a few basic pieces of furniture. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The closest neighbor was a couple of miles away, and that's how I liked it. The more isolated, the better. The cabin sat on a stretch of land that had been in the family for years, passed down from my grandfather. It had a great view of the forest, and in the winter, it looked like something out of a painting, all quiet and still, with snow piled up thick on the ground and the trees weighed down with ice. I remember the first night I spent there. I had just finished building the cabin, still had that new wood smell all around. The sun dipped behind the trees, and I started a fire in the stove. The wind howled outside, and I sat by the fire, listening to the crackling wood. The darkness in the woods felt alive. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you weren't alone, but at the same time, you couldn't shake the feeling that the land was watching you. I wasn't sure what made me feel that way, but I couldn't help it. Maybe it was the way the forest felt like it stretched on forever, the trees tall and looming. There were days when it felt like the world outside of the cabin didn't exist, and all that mattered was the space between me and everything else. That first winter, I stayed out there alone for weeks at a time. I'd go out hunting during the day, and by night, I'd return to the cabin to cook whatever I had gotten, if anything at all. Those first days, I didn't really think much about the quiet or the emptiness. It was only after I'd been there for a while that I started noticing things. Little things at first, but they all added up. Things that seemed normal but slowly became unsettling. I had a few old trail cameras set up around the land just to keep track of the animals, especially during the hunting season. I checked them every week or so when I went into town for supplies. One evening, I was coming back from one of those trips when I saw something strange. I wasn't far from the cabin, just down the trail, when I noticed fresh tracks in the snow. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something larger like a bear. But the tracks were too big, and there was something off about them. They didn't look right. I decided to follow them. The snow was deep, and it was starting to get dark. I couldn't help myself, though. There was a part of me that needed to know what had made them. So I pushed forward, deeper into the woods. The tracks led me to the edge of a clearing, a place where the trees opened up into a small grove. I paused, trying to make sense of the situation. The tracks stopped at the edge of the clearing, and I couldn't see any more footprints on the other side. It was strange. There was no sign of anything else moving through the snow. I decided to turn back, but as I turned around, something caught my eye. Across the clearing, just barely visible through the trees, I saw a shape. At first, it looked like another tree, but then I realized it wasn't. It was too dark, too still. It was standing there, watching me. I froze. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the shape, but eventually, it moved. Slowly, like it was testing me or maybe just watching to see what I would do. When it stepped forward, I could see it clearly, just for a moment before it disappeared into the trees. It wasn't a person. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't a person. I didn't go back out there for a while after that. For the next few days, I stayed close to the cabin, mostly hunting near the edges of the woods where I felt safer. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But every night, when the wind picked up and the trees creaked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, not at first. I didn't want to sound crazy. It was just a shape, after all. Could have been an animal, maybe a shadow cast by the trees. But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. The thing I saw, if it even was a thing, wasn't natural. It didn't belong out there. Weeks passed, and I tried to focus on the hunting. The woods were quiet, but there was something different about the air. It felt thick, like the atmosphere was heavy with something unspoken. Then, one evening, I returned to the cabin after a long day of hunting and saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The door to the cabin was wide open. I had locked it before I left. There was no way it could have blown open. The wind hadn't been strong enough, and the latch on the door was solid. I approached cautiously, hand on my rifle, and stepped inside. The place was just as I had left it, except for the footprints in the dust. They were small, too small to be mine, and they led from the door to the window. Whoever had been inside had gone to the window, looked out, and then left. I checked the rest of the cabin. Nothing was taken, nothing was disturbed. But the feeling that something was wrong, that something wasn't right, hit me harder than ever. I knew then that I wasn't alone out there. Whoever or whatever had been in my cabin, it wasn't just passing through. It knew where I lived. It knew where I kept my things. That night, I stayed up late, sitting in a chair by the stove with my rifle across my lap. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The fire crackled, but it felt like the warmth from the stove couldn't reach the cold that had settled in my chest. Around midnight, I heard it. The sound was faint at first, just a rustling in the woods. But then it grew louder, closer. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too calculated. The footsteps were slow, measured, and they weren't alone. There was something else, something that made my skin crawl. It was like the woods themselves were shifting, moving, pressing in on me. I stood up, gripping the rifle, heart pounding. The sound came closer and closer, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited, breath held, listening, but there was nothing. No movement, no rustling. It was as if the woods had swallowed whatever was out there. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't want to, but something in me knew I couldn't stay there anymore. The woods were too quiet, too still. I didn't know who or what had been out there, but I wasn't willing to risk finding out. I didn't go back to the cabin for months. When I did, I made sure to bring a friend with me. The place was still standing, still the same, but the feeling in the air had changed. It was colder, emptier, like the woods had taken something from me. I didn't see anything strange again. No more figures in the trees. No more sounds in the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were still watching me. Eventually, I sold the cabin. I couldn't bear to stay there any longer, and the thought of anyone else using it made my skin crawl. The land, the woods, they all felt like they were waiting for something, and I wasn't about to find out what. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks on me or if there really was something in the woods. But one thing's for sure. I learned the hard way that sometimes the woods keep their secrets, and some things are better left alone. The cabin stood alone in the middle of the woods, surrounded by thick trees and tangled underbrush that seemed to swallow up the light. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a place to disconnect from the world, breathe in the fresh air, and forget about the grind of everyday life. I was looking forward to it, especially after the long drive out to the mountains, where I could finally get away from the noise of the city. I had been craving silence, the kind of quiet you can only find when you're far from people, far from traffic, far from the usual distractions. The cabin was an old, weathered building. Its logs were darkened with age, and the roof sagged slightly in places where the snow had built up over the years. But it had charm, and that was enough. I was alone, and that was part of the plan. I figured I'd spend the weekend reading, cooking some simple meals, and maybe taking a few walks through the forest. The kind of break I needed. The first night, everything was calm. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly overhead, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I settled into the cabin, lit a fire in the wood stove, and cracked open a book. The warm light from the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in months. But the quiet didn't last. The next morning, I woke up early. The sunlight was barely breaking through the trees, and the air had that crisp, fresh smell that only comes with mornings in the mountains. I stepped outside for a breath of air, enjoying the coolness on my skin. The woods were alive with sounds, birds calling, the wind rustling through the branches, and the distant sound of a stream running somewhere nearby. I decided to go for a walk. The woods were dense, the trees thick with needles, and the ground soft with fallen leaves. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't anything specific, just an odd sensation that something was off. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I tried to brush it off and continued down the narrow trail that wound through the trees. About an hour into the walk, I heard something, a rustling in the underbrush. I stopped, listening. At first, I thought it was just a deer or a small animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. It wasn't the usual scurrying of a squirrel or the shuffle of a rabbit. This was something larger. I stood still, straining my ears, waiting for the sound to stop. But it didn't. The rustling grew louder, closer. I took a few cautious steps back, moving quietly, hoping it was just an animal going about its business. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't like anything I had ever heard before. Not a dog, not a bear. It was more unsettling. My heart started to beat faster, and a cold sweat formed on the back of my neck. The hair on my arms stood on end. I felt the hairs of instinct telling me to turn around and leave. But I didn't. I kept walking, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease in my chest. I had always prided myself on being calm in the face of fear, but now I could feel that familiar prickling sensation of danger creeping up my spine. I came to a clearing, and there, standing at the edge, I saw something that made my stomach drop. It was a creature, unlike anything I had ever seen before. It looked like a dog, but it was wrong. Its body was longer than a typical dog's, and its fur was matted and uneven, as if it hadn't been groomed in years. Its eyes were a deep, almost unnatural yellow, and they glowed faintly in the dim light. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing sharp teeth that looked too big for its size. Its head was larger than a normal dog's, and its ears were pointed, twitching as it watched me. I froze. The creature didn't move, but its eyes never left me. There was a sense of intelligence behind those eyes, and it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just some wild animal. It was something else, something aware. I slowly took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The creature's ears flicked, and it let out another low growl. It wasn't moving toward me, but it wasn't backing down either. It just stood there watching, waiting. I turned and began walking away slowly, never taking my eyes off of it. I felt the tension in my chest, the urge to run, but I knew better. Running would only provoke it. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door behind me, my heart pounding. I locked all the windows and doors, and for the first time, I realized just how alone I was. No one was around. No one would hear me if something went wrong. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a wild animal, maybe a coyote or something similar. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a normal animal. That feeling, that instinct told me otherwise. The day passed slowly. I didn't go back outside. Instead, I spent the rest of the day inside, reading and trying to distract myself. But every so often, I'd hear something, a twig snapping, the sound of something large moving around just outside the cabin. My heart would race, and I'd find myself staring out the windows, half expecting to see those yellow eyes watching me. As night fell, I lit the fire again, hoping the warmth would bring some comfort. But the silence of the cabin was suffocating. Every crackling sound of the fire made my nerves jump. I kept thinking about that creature, about how it had watched me so closely. It was out there somewhere. I could feel it. Then, just after midnight, I heard it. A soft scratching at the door. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, didn't even breathe for a moment. The scratching continued, slow, deliberate. It wasn't a random animal pawing at the door. It was methodical, like it knew exactly what it was doing. I sat frozen, my mind racing, my heart hammering in my chest. What the hell was it? Why was it here? I wanted to call someone, but I had no signal. No one would get here in time anyway. I was on my own. The scratching stopped, but the tension in the air remained. I couldn't bring myself to open the door and check. I just stayed where I was, sitting on the couch, staring at the door as if somehow, by sheer force of will, I could will it to open and show me what was on the other side. Minutes passed, hours maybe, I don't know. Time felt like it had stopped, or maybe it was just my brain losing track of it all. I couldn't stay inside forever, though. The door was locked, the windows were secure, but the creature was still out there somewhere, watching. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was shining through the cracks in the curtains, and the quiet of the forest had returned. For a moment, I thought maybe it had all been a bad dream, but then I remembered. The creature, the scratching, it had been real. I gathered my things, packed up what I could, and decided to leave. I didn't want to stay another night. I had come here to find peace, but I had found something far worse. I wasn't sure if that thing was still out there, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. I locked the cabin and drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. As I passed through the trees, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that creature standing in the road, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the trees, the empty road, and the silence. I never went back to that cabin, and I never wanted to be that alone again. The woods had taken something from me that weekend, something I couldn't quite explain, but something I knew I would never get back. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, a break from the stress of work, the city, the constant noise and buzz. My friend Jason and I had rented a cabin tucked deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest neighbor. It was a rustic old place, built with thick logs, a small stone fireplace, and windows that framed nothing but trees and empty space. The kind of place where you could forget the outside world existed. We arrived just before sundown, after a long drive down a winding gravel road, the kind that shakes the car and leaves a fine layer of dust everywhere. The cabin was exactly what we were looking for. Isolated, old, and a little weathered, but perfect for the weekend. We unloaded our stuff, cracked open a couple of beers, and settled in. The sun dipped behind the trees, and darkness quickly overtook the place. The first night was calm. The air was cool and crisp, with a slight breeze rustling through the leaves. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. Jason and I talked about nothing important, just the usual stuff, stories from work, things we'd done in the past. As we got comfortable, the sounds of the woods filled the silence. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of animals in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a branch. By around midnight, the fire was dying down and we decided to head to bed. The cabin was small, with 2 rooms. Jason took the room to the left, and I took the one on the right. I didn't feel particularly scared, but I wasn't used to the solitude of such a remote place. The woods outside were dense and dark, and the only sound was the occasional wind or animal noise. Around 3 a.m., I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I just felt this unease, this strange pressure in the air. The kind of feeling you get when you know something is off but can't figure out exactly what it is. I listened carefully, trying to ignore the feeling. But there it was again, the faint sound of something scratching. It was distant, almost too soft to hear, but it was there, coming from somewhere outside. I sat up in bed and strained my ears. The scratching continued for a while, then stopped. I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer brushing up against the cabin. I closed my eyes, but the sound came again. This time, it was louder, like something was pacing around the cabin. I got out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped into the living room. The cabin was eerily quiet now, and the moonlight coming through the windows made everything look strange and unfamiliar. I checked the locks on the doors and looked out the small kitchen window that faced the woods. Nothing seemed out of place. I stood there for a moment, listening. The wind had picked up, and the trees were swaying gently. But the sound, that scraping, dragging noise, was gone. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just my imagination. After all, it was easy to get creeped out in a place like this, surrounded by nothing but woods and darkness. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept racing, and every little noise outside made my heart jump. The next morning, Jason and I decided to go hiking. We needed to get out of the cabin and clear our heads. We packed a couple of sandwiches, grabbed some water, and headed out into the woods. The trail was just behind the cabin, cutting through thick trees and underbrush. We walked for a couple of hours, enjoying the peace and quiet, but my mind kept drifting back to the noises I'd heard the night before. On the way back to the cabin, we saw something strange. At first, it didn't register, but as we got closer, I could see it clearly. It was a set of tracks, large and deep, dug into the dirt. The prints were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They were too big for a deer, too round for a bear. They had a strange shape, almost canine, but with elongated toes and deep claws. Jason noticed them at the same time I did, and we both crouched down to get a closer look. "Those are weird," Jason muttered. "What kind of animal makes prints like that?" I didn't have an answer, but I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Something about the tracks felt wrong. They were too fresh, too deliberate. It was as if whatever had made them had been watching us, moving just out of sight, careful not to leave too much evidence behind. We continued on, but the rest of the hike was uncomfortable. The air felt heavier, and the silence was unnerving. We didn't see anything else unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, the strange noises started again. I tried to ignore them, but they were more persistent this time. It wasn't just scratching, it was dragging, like something heavy was being pulled across the ground. Then came a thud, followed by more dragging. I sat up in bed and listened, my heart pounding in my chest. Jason, still asleep, didn't seem to notice. I grabbed my flashlight again and stepped out into the living room. The fire had long since gone out, and the cabin was dark except for the faint light of the flashlight beam. I pointed it at the window, but there was nothing outside, just the dark outline of the trees against the night sky. Still, the sense of unease lingered, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I moved toward the front door and cracked it open, just enough to peer outside. My flashlight swept over the porch, the yard, and then out into the woods. Nothing. But then I saw something. A shape standing just inside the tree line. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a tree, but then it moved. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall, too tall for a human. It stood on two legs, but its posture was odd, hunched, as though it wasn't quite comfortable standing that way. Its head was large and pointed, like a dog's, but far too big. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its arms were too long, reaching down almost to its knees. It was completely still, staring at me through the trees. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. My mind was racing, but I couldn't move. It was as if something inside me was telling me not to make a sound, not to draw attention to myself. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, pounding louder with each passing second. Finally, I stepped back from the door, heart hammering. I moved quietly, trying not to wake Jason. I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. My mind was racing. I had to tell him, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What if he thought I was just seeing things? What if it wasn't real? The rest of the night was torture. The creature, or whatever it was, never came closer, but I could feel its presence out there. I could hear the occasional rustle in the trees, the sound of heavy breathing carried on the wind. But nothing approached the cabin. By morning, I was exhausted. I had barely slept, and I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to stay another night, but I didn't want to tell Jason about what I'd seen, either. I decided to wait until the sun was up and then leave. I packed my things in a hurry, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Jason, still groggy from sleep, asked me what was going on. I told him I wasn't feeling well, and I just wanted to head home. He didn't argue, though he seemed a little confused. We left the cabin around mid-morning, and as we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The cabin sat there, silent and still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the woods. I never went back, and every time I think about that cabin, about the strange creature I saw out there, I feel a chill run down my spine. Maybe it was just a figment of my imagination, or maybe it was something more, something that shouldn't have been in those woods. Either way, I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of knowing something was out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. The day had started like any other. The sun was a little too bright for my liking, casting long shadows across the small town where I lived. It wasn't a big place, just a handful of roads and houses scattered among the trees. Most people knew each other, but we weren't the sort of community that got too close. Quiet, secluded. I'd grown up here, and to be honest, I never thought much about the woods that surrounded us. Sure, they were big, huge even, but I'd never had a reason to venture deep into them. Until that day, I was tired of the same old routine. Work was slow, and the isolation of living in such a small town had begun to feel oppressive. I decided to take a walk in the woods, something I hadn't done in years. Maybe it was the heat getting to me, or maybe it was just the boredom that made the idea seem appealing. Either way, I packed a small bag, grabbed a water bottle, and started off on a trail I hadn't taken since I was a kid. The trail wasn't marked, not that it mattered much. There were enough paths leading into the woods that you could get lost if you weren't careful. I'd wandered out here plenty of times before, always circling back by the end of the day. This time, though, I decided to push further. There was something about the way the trees seemed to stretch forever, their branches thick and tangled, blocking the sun in some places. It was peaceful in a way, but the silence also felt like it was pressing in on me, like the woods were alive with something just out of sight. I must have walked for hours, but time felt irrelevant out there. There were no sounds but the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot, the chirp of birds in the distance, and the distant wind swaying the treetops. I was almost at the point where I was considering turning back when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow among the trees. It was set back from the trail a little, but still visible enough for me to see the shape clearly. A cabin. Old, maybe abandoned, with the kind of weathered wood that told stories of age and neglect. The roof sagged in a way that made it look like it had been through too many storms. The windows were dark, the glass cracked or missing entirely. For a moment, I stood there, just staring at it. Something about the place didn't feel right, but curiosity won out. I wasn't far off the trail, so I decided to investigate. The closer I got, the more the cabin seemed to draw me in. I had no reason to think anything was wrong. After all, people came up to the woods all the time. Maybe someone had built it years ago and just stopped caring for it. But as I stepped onto the rotting porch, I felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I reached for the door, almost expecting it to creak open on its own. Didn't. It was locked, or at least stuck. I pushed harder, feeling a faint resistance. Then the door groaned and finally gave way with a loud scrape, like the house itself was sighing in relief. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. A mix of mold and something else, something sour that I couldn't place. The air was thick, stale. The room was dark, with only a little light trickling in from the gaps in the boarded-up windows. My eyes adjusted quickly, and I saw the place in its full disarray. Dust covered everything. There were old furniture pieces, broken chairs, a table turned over, its legs sticking out like dead spiders. Everything looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry, but there was no obvious sign of why. I walked deeper into the cabin, noticing the layers of dirt on the floor, the yellowing papers scattered across what had once been a countertop. Something caught my eye then. A piece of paper, folded carefully and placed under a stack of old magazines. It looked too out of place in the mess, and I hesitated before picking it up. It was a letter, handwritten. The paper was brittle, almost falling apart in my hands as I unfolded it. The words were simple, written in a hurried scrawl, but they were enough to make my stomach tighten. Please don't come here. The woods are not what they seem. Leave while you still can. They'll find you. I stared at the letter for a long time. My first instinct was to laugh, brush it off as some bizarre joke. But then I noticed something else, something that made my blood run cold. There were stains on the paper, old brown stains that looked too much like dried blood. I dropped the letter, suddenly aware of how heavy the air had become around me. I wasn't sure what was worse, the letter itself or the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The walls seemed to close in a little as I tried to shake the feeling off. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. It was a noise, soft, almost imperceptible at first, came from upstairs. It sounded like something shifting, like footsteps moving quietly, deliberately. I froze, holding my breath. For a moment, I thought I might be imagining it. But then the sound came again, a slow creak of floorboards above me. I stood perfectly still, listening. The air felt heavier now, almost suffocating. I knew I needed to leave, but my feet didn't move. The noise continued, closer now. The slow creak of movement. Someone or something was up there. I backed away slowly, not daring to make a sound. My heart was pounding in my chest. The noise grew louder, more distinct. It was definitely footsteps now. Someone was upstairs, moving through the place like they were waiting for something, or someone. I turned and ran for the door, slamming it open with a force I hadn't meant. The porch creaked under my weight as I jumped off it and started sprinting back toward the trail. The woods seemed darker now, the trees pressing in on me as if trying to trap me there. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the trail, gasping for breath, my heart still racing. I didn't look back. I didn't care to. The cabin was gone the next time I tried to go back. The trees had grown thicker. The path twisted in such a way that I couldn't find the spot where I had seen it. It was like it had never existed at all. I never spoke of it to anyone, not even to my closest friends. I didn't want to seem crazy, didn't want to explain how something that felt so real could disappear without a trace. But that day stuck with me. I could never shake the feeling that I had been followed, that whatever had been in that cabin was still out there, waiting. I still take walks in the woods sometimes, but I never venture that deep. Not anymore. It's a small town, yes, but the woods are vast, and there are places out there I'll never return to. The sun had started to set as I made my way back to the cabin. I'd been out all day, collecting firewood, walking through the woods, and just enjoying the quiet of the place. The cabin, tucked away in the woods far from any real civilization, had always been a peaceful retreat. I'd rented it for the weekend, hoping to escape the noise and the chaos of the city for a few days of solitude. The air was crisp, and I could hear the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots as I approached the cabin. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, rustic building with a wood-burning stove, a couple of old chairs, and a large window overlooking the forest. The kind of place where you could just sit by the fire, watch the flames dance, and let the world fall away. I didn't have any plans for the night, just to cook a simple dinner and maybe read a book by the fire. But as I got closer, I noticed something out of place. The cabin's door was ajar. I was sure I'd closed it when I left that morning. I had locked it, too. I hesitated for a moment, a small knot of unease forming in my stomach. Maybe I'd forgotten, or maybe the wind had pushed it open. It didn't seem like anyone else was around. There was no car in the driveway, no signs of life nearby. Still, the door being open didn't sit right with me. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of pine wood and the faint smell of stale fire smoke filling the air. Everything seemed normal at first. The fire in the stove had burned down to just a few glowing embers. The chairs sat undisturbed, and my bag was still in the corner where I had left it. But something felt wrong, a kind of stillness that didn't seem natural. It was as if the entire cabin was holding its breath. I moved further inside, my boots tapping lightly against the wooden floor. I scanned the room, my eyes lingering on every corner. The feeling grew stronger. I felt watched, but there was no one. The only sounds were the crackle of the dying embers and the soft wind outside. My hand instinctively went to the knife in my jacket pocket. Not that I thought I'd need it, but it was a habit, a way to reassure myself. I reached the small kitchen area, and that's when I saw it. There, lying on the counter, was a shard of glass. It wasn't huge, but it was sharp, its jagged edges catching the dim light from the stove. The glass was dark, almost black, as though it had been stained with something. I couldn't place it at first, but as I stared at it, I realized it was blood. Dark, dried blood. A shiver ran down my spine. I stepped back instinctively, my hand gripping the edge of the counter for balance. Who had been here? How had they gotten inside? I had locked everything up before I left. And yet here was this shard of glass, covered in blood. I glanced at the window, but there was nothing unusual about it. No sign of forced entry. The door, I couldn't help but think about it again. Was I imagining things? Had I been so distracted by the woods that I didn't notice someone breaking in? My mind raced, trying to piece things together, but the longer I stood there, the more uneasy I became. The glass, the blood, what had happened here? Was someone injured? Were they still nearby? I took a deep breath and slowly moved to the door. I needed to check outside. I needed to see if someone was lurking nearby, if anyone had been watching me. But as I reached for the door, I heard it. A soft sound, a scrape, came from behind me from the back room. The room where the bathroom was, where the closet was. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was moving in the cabin. I froze. The sound stopped. For a long moment, all I could hear was the beat of my own heart, thudding loudly in my chest. My fingers tightened around the doorknob, but I didn't turn it. I stood there, my breath shallow, straining to hear any other noise. Another scrape, closer this time. I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. I couldn't just leave either, not without knowing who or what was in there with me. I grabbed my bag from the corner and pulled out a flashlight, flicking it on and shining it towards the back of the room. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but a few scattered items. A pile of clothes I'd left on the floor, a chair that seemed out of place. The flashlight flickered as I turned it over, the beam briefly dancing over the floor before settling on something unexpected. A trail of blood, small droplets, leading from the kitchen toward the back room. I swallowed hard. The blood on the glass, the shard of it, it wasn't just a random accident. Someone had been here and they were hurt. Or worse, they were still here. I gripped the flashlight harder, the metal digging into my palm as I moved slowly toward the bloodstains. Each step felt like it echoed in the still cabin. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat, my legs trembling as the beam of light moved across the floor. The blood trail led directly to the back room, the room I'd avoided. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see nothing beyond it but darkness. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was small, barely big enough for a bed and a dresser. There was no sign of anyone at first. No shadow moving in the corner, no shape standing in the dark. But then I saw it, a figure, lying on the floor, blood pooling around him. The man was unconscious, his face pale, his chest barely rising and falling. In his hand, he gripped something shiny. It was another shard of glass, embedded deep into his palm. I rushed over to him, kneeling beside his limp body. He was breathing, though it was shallow. I didn't know what had happened to him, how he'd gotten here, why he was bleeding, why he was holding that shard, but he needed help, fast. I reached into my bag for my phone, but it was gone. I cursed under my breath, my mind spinning. There was no signal out here, anyway. No way to call for help. I was alone, and so was he. I looked around for something, anything that might help. My eyes landed on a small first aid kit hanging on the wall near the dresser. I grabbed it, tearing open the kit and quickly assessing what I had. A gauze pad, antiseptic wipes, bandages, some tape. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I gently cleaned the glass shard in his hand, wrapping it in a piece of cloth so I could carefully pull it free. His hand twitched as I did, and I froze, thinking he might wake up. But he didn't. I took a deep breath and continued, pulling the shard free with a sickening, squelching sound. His blood, warm and thick, soaked through my fingers as I applied pressure to the wound. Took a while, but I finally managed to stop the bleeding. The man's breathing had steadied by then, though he still hadn't stirred. I looked down at him, trying to figure out what to do next. Should I leave him here and go for help? Should I try to carry him out? I didn't know how long he'd been out here, but I couldn't just leave him. If I did, he might not survive the night. I glanced around the cabin again. The door was still open, the cool night air rushing in, but I knew I couldn't risk going outside just yet. I couldn't leave him alone, not with whoever or whatever might be out there. I sat by his side for the rest of the night, keeping watch over him. His shallow breathing filled the silence of the cabin. The fire in the stove long since burned out. I wasn't sure what had happened, but I had no doubt that I was lucky. Lucky I hadn't found something worse. Lucky that the man hadn't died in the woods. I wasn't sure what had caused the blood, the shard of glass, or why he was in the cabin in the first place. But whatever it wasn't over yet. When the sun rose the next morning, I had made my decision. I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. I needed to get out. I needed to find help for the man and get to safety. As I packed up my things and prepared to leave, I took one last look at the man lying on the floor. He was still unconscious but stable. The shard of glass was nowhere to be found, and the blood had dried on the floor. It was a mess, but I didn't have time to clean up. I had to go. I locked the cabin door behind me, grabbed the man's coat to try and keep him warm, and made my way back to my car. The woods were still, but they weren't peaceful. I had no idea who had left the man there, why they had done it, or what had really happened. But I couldn't wait to find out. I needed to get help, and fast. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a crackling fire and the smell of burning wood. The kind of smell that's thick and comforting. The cabin felt warm, the floorboards creaking slightly as I shifted in my blanket. My dad had built this place when I was a kid, and it had always felt like a safe retreat in the middle of nowhere. It was a small, simple cabin, tucked far enough in the woods that you couldn't hear a single car or any sign of life. The closest town was at least 2 hours away, and we loved it like that. The only sounds you'd hear were the wind through the trees or the occasional animal rustling in the brush. Most nights, I would sleep like a rock, surrounded by the quiet darkness of the forest. But tonight was different. I hadn't heard it at first. The wind had died down, and the stillness of the night was only broken by the sound of my breathing. But then, faintly, I heard a sound. Something heavy, something rhythmic. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the trees, but this sound was too deliberate. It was like a pounding, but not in a steady pattern. It was irregular, almost like someone was trying to chop wood, but the strokes were all wrong, like the rhythm of an axe. I froze, heart thudding in my chest. The only place where anyone would be chopping wood this time of night was right outside the cabin. I wasn't sure how long I lay there, listening to the sound, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Could have been a tree falling, maybe, or an animal. But no, the sound was too purposeful. It was too controlled. No animal could make that noise. I glanced at the window beside my bed. The curtains were drawn, but the moonlight outside made the trees look like eerie shadows stretching in all directions. I listened again, straining to make sense of the noise. The chopping continued, each strike growing louder and closer. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere around the back of the cabin. The cabin wasn't big, maybe 2 rooms upstairs, a small kitchen, and the living room downstairs. My dad always used to say that the back of the cabin was the most dangerous part, where the woods were thickest, and nobody ever came from that direction unless they were lost or had bad intentions. I couldn't even remember the last time we'd had a visitor at the cabin. The nearest neighbor was miles away. Hell, we didn't even get many hikers up this far. I stood up from my bed, my feet hitting the cool wood floor. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow over the room. I grabbed the flashlight from the table beside my bed, holding it tight in my hand as I approached the window, trying to peer out into the blackness. Outside, nothing, just the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind. But the sound of the axe, it was still there, closer now, too close for comfort. I crept down the stairs, careful not to make a sound. The old wooden steps creaked beneath my weight, the sound sharp in the otherwise silent night. My mind raced, running through scenarios. Who could be out there? Why would anyone be chopping wood at this hour? My dad had always kept the place locked tight, but I still felt uneasy. I made my way to the door, but before I could reach for the handle, a sudden, loud crash of wood splitting outside made me jump back. It was followed by a grunt, a sound that was too human. Couldn't breathe. My heart was in my throat as I stood frozen, listening. The figure out there had stopped chopping, but I could hear him moving now, dragging something across the ground, scraping against the dirt and leaves. It sounded deliberate. He was coming closer. I barely had time to think before the door handle jiggled. My breath caught in my chest as I realized whoever was out there had just tried to open the door. I backed away, heart pounding. The lock, the deadbolt. I rushed to check both, finding them secure. But that didn't make me feel any safer. I could still hear the man. His movements, his breathing, the occasional scrape of metal on wood as the axe swung again. I grabbed the phone from the kitchen counter, trying to dial the number for the sheriff's office. But the signal was weak here and the call failed. My stomach twisted. No service out here meant nobody was coming to help. I was alone. My mind raced again. If I called out to him, tried to confront him, would he just leave? Or would he get angry? I knew better than to think he would leave peacefully. I wasn't about to go outside and try to talk to him, not with the axe in his hand. And I couldn't hide in here forever. I went to the window again, this time pulling the curtain slightly to the side, peering out. My flashlight beam swept over the ground outside, and I saw the figure. Just a silhouette in the shadows, but tall and broad. He was standing near the edge of the woods, not far from the back door. The axe was slung over his shoulder, his stance relaxed, like he was waiting. Waiting for what? Couldn't tell. His face was obscured by the darkness, but the fact that he wasn't doing anything made me feel worse. I took a deep breath, trying to think. There was no way I could fight this guy. He was probably bigger and stronger than me, and there was only one way out of the cabin, the front door. But if I ran for the front door, there was a good chance he'd catch me. I didn't know how far he was from the cabin, but I didn't want to risk it. I moved back to the kitchen, where I knew my dad kept a rifle locked in the cabinet. It was there for hunting, just in case we needed it. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the cabinet and pulled it out. I hadn't fired it much, but I knew how to use it. I just didn't want to. I crept to the front door, setting the rifle beside me. I could still hear the man outside, but the sounds were quieter now. The air felt thick, like time was slowing down. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in short, shallow gasps. I had to get outside, but how? How could I get past him without him seeing me? Without making a sound? I gathered my courage and decided to make my move. I pulled the door open slowly, just enough to slip outside. I could see the man now, standing still near the edge of the trees. He hadn't noticed me yet. I darted around the side of the cabin, staying low to the ground. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might give me away. The cold night air stung my skin, but I didn't dare make a sound. I could feel the sweat running down my back as I rounded the corner, praying the man wouldn't hear my footsteps. The flashlight. I forgot about the flashlight. It was still in my hand. I ducked behind the corner of the cabin, trying to catch my breath. I could hear the man's footsteps now, heavy, deliberate. He was moving, but still too close to the front door. If he went inside, I would be trapped. I squeezed the rifle tightly, holding it close. My fingers were numb from the cold, but I had to stay focused. If I made it to the woods, I could disappear. I just had to make it there. I had to move quickly. I darted into the trees, my footfalls soft against the ground. The shadows were thick here, but I knew the land well enough to navigate in the dark. I didn't dare look back. If he saw me now, I wouldn't make it. I kept moving, every sense on high alert, until I could no longer hear his footsteps. The man was gone. The night was silent again, except for the distant rustle of the trees in the wind. I finally stopped, breathing heavily, my body shaking from the adrenaline. I could hear the soft whispers of the woods around me, the night alive with small sounds, crickets, rustling leaves. I wasn't sure how long I stayed there, waiting. My pulse slowly started to calm, and I realized that I had made it out. But as I stood there, still hidden in the woods, the realization hit me. I wasn't safe. Not yet. Not until I was far away from that cabin, far from that man with the axe. Eventually, I did what I knew I had to. I kept moving. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest neighbor's house hours later. The sheriff was called, and I told them everything. But the man was never found. The woods, as always, kept their secrets. Living in that cabin wasn't supposed to be my life. It wasn't supposed to be anyone's life. But when I found myself with nowhere to go, when everything I thought I knew about the world had crumbled, the cabin became my last option. It had been abandoned for years, maybe even decades, tucked deep in the woods where no one really bothered to go. The type of place people only whispered about if they talked about it at all. It wasn't just me, though. I had my friend with me. We had been through a lot together, both of us kind of running from things, running from our own versions of life that had gone wrong. We didn't talk about it much, but we knew. We understood each other. When we ended up together, just the two of us, stuck in a place like this, we didn't really know what we were getting into. But we figured we could make it work, at least for a while. We didn't have much to our names. A couple of bags of clothes, some basic food we could barely afford, and a few old tools we found in the shed behind the cabin. It wasn't much, but it was enough to survive, at least for a little while. The cabin was nothing special. Small, run down, with peeling paint and a roof that looked like it might cave in at any moment. The windows were dirty, cracked in places, but still held together. There was a fireplace, but it hadn't been used in years, probably longer than either of us had been alive. The floorboards creaked underfoot like they were going to break through, and the whole place smelled musty, like stale air and rotting wood. But when you've got nowhere else to go, you take what you can get. We made ourselves comfortable, or as comfortable as you could get in a place like that. I remember the first night we spent there. The sun was already dipping below the horizon by the time we made it inside. The woods outside were silent, almost too silent. Felt like the whole world had gone to sleep. We sat there for hours, not saying much, just listening to the sound of the wind rattling the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I didn't mention it. My friend didn't either. Maybe we were both just too tired, too worn out from the journey to really think about it. The first few days weren't too bad. We gathered firewood, cleaned up the place a bit, and tried to make a semblance of a home out of the old, rotting structure. But soon, the reality of being stuck in that cabin started to set in. It was colder than we'd anticipated, even though it wasn't really winter yet. The walls were thin, and the fireplace didn't do much to keep the place warm. It was a constant struggle to keep a fire going, and when it went out in the middle of the night, it was impossible to get back to sleep. We'd huddle under the threadbare blankets we found, shivering until morning. I started noticing things, too, little things that didn't quite add up. The way the wind seemed to howl louder on certain nights, like something was pushing through the trees, something that wasn't supposed to be there. The way the cabin creaked and groaned, like it was alive, shifting under its own weight. At first, I told myself it was just the wind or the wood settling. But after a while, it started to feel like something else. We tried to ignore it, but there were nights when neither of us could sleep. When the wind was howling, and the trees outside rattled so loud it felt like the whole forest was about to come crashing down on top of us. The first time I heard the noise, I thought it was just my imagination. It sounded like footsteps, faint at first, then growing louder. I froze, listening, my heart thumping in my chest. I didn't want to wake my friend, so I stayed quiet, holding my breath. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled around the cabin, slow and deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or something else roaming around outside. But the way they moved, the pattern, it didn't feel like any animal I'd ever heard. I tried to shake it off, but the next night, the same thing happened. I could hear the footsteps again, but this time, I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. There was someone or something out there. I didn't want to tell my friend. I didn't want to make it worse, so I kept it to myself, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. Days passed, and the feeling of being watched, of being followed, grew stronger. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like eyes were on me. I kept hearing things in the distance. Twigs snapping, rustling in the trees. I wasn't sure if it was just the wind, or if there was something out there, lurking just beyond my sight. My friend seemed to notice too, but neither of us spoke about it. Maybe we were both too scared to acknowledge it. We began to run out of food too. Our supplies were dwindling, and we weren't sure when we'd be able to go into town again. The nearest store was hours away, and the road to get there was barely passable. We talked about leaving, about trying to find a safer place, but something kept us there. Maybe it was the fear of the unknown. Maybe it was the fact that we had nowhere else to go. But every time we talked about it, something always stopped us. Something kept us in that cabin, surrounded by nothing but trees and emptiness. Then one night, everything changed. It was late, and the wind had picked up again. The trees outside were shaking, their branches creaking in the gusts. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to block out the noise. But then I heard it, footsteps. Not just the ones I'd heard before, but this time they were closer, much closer. They were right outside the door, slow and deliberate. I could feel my heart racing in my chest. I held my breath, hoping that whatever it was would go away. But it didn't. The footsteps stopped, and then there was silence. Absolute silence. I lay there in the dark, waiting. Felt like the entire world was holding its breath. I wanted to move, to do something, but I couldn't. It was like I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't want to know what was out there. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the silence was broken. A loud bang echoed through the cabin, and I shot up, my heart pounding in my chest. It was coming from the door. I could hear the scraping of metal against wood, like someone or something was trying to force their way in. My mind was racing, and I couldn't think clearly. I grabbed my friend, shaking them awake. We didn't speak. There was no time for that. We scrambled to the back of the cabin, hoping to find a way out, but the windows were too small, the walls too thick. The only way out was the door, and whatever was outside was blocking it. I could hear it now, breathing, slow and steady, like it was waiting for us to make a move. We didn't have much of a choice. We had to leave. We had to get out, and fast. We grabbed what little we had left and bolted for the door. I don't know how we made it out. It was like the cabin itself was trying to hold us in, like the walls were closing in on us. But we made it outside, into the cold night air. The wind was biting, but it didn't matter. We ran, not knowing where we were going, just knowing we couldn't stay there anymore. We didn't stop until we reached the main road. I don't know how long it took. Time felt like it had stopped. But when we finally got to the road, we found a car passing by. We flagged it down, and the driver stopped, looking at us like we were crazy. We didn't care. We climbed in, not saying a word. We didn't go back to the cabin. We didn't go back to that place, that nightmare. I don't know what it was or who or what was out there, but I'll never forget the feeling of being trapped, of hearing those footsteps, of knowing that something was waiting for us. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some fairy tale creature. It was real, and it was out there. We made it out, and that's all that matters. The cabin stayed behind, left to rot in the woods, and I never looked back. It was late November when I moved into the cabin, a small, weathered structure hidden deep in the woods. It wasn't much, just one room with a fireplace, a kitchen nook, and a loft above that I used for sleeping. The nearest town was about a 40-minute drive, and I had already decided I wanted solitude. No neighbors, no bustling noise, just me and the woods. The first few days were quiet in a peaceful way, just the sound of the wind rustling the trees and the occasional bird call. The air was cold, but the firewood I'd chopped before moving in kept the place warm enough. There was a certain satisfaction in the small things. Making my own meals, washing dishes in the sink by the window, and watching the snow start to fall outside as I sat by the fire. But it didn't take long for the quiet to start feeling like something else. The woods were never completely still, and sometimes, as the light faded, I'd hear things. The crack of a branch snapping in the distance or the shuffle of animals moving through the underbrush. At first, I chalked it up to the usual sounds of nature, but over time, it felt as if I was being watched, even though I knew there was no one around for miles. The first real unsettling experience happened one evening when I was sitting by the fire. It was already dark, and the cabin was completely quiet except for the occasional crackle of the logs burning. I'd been reading a book, trying to ignore the growing unease in my stomach, when I heard it. A knock. It wasn't loud, but distinct. It came from the back door, which was on the side of the cabin facing the woods. The wind wasn't blowing, and there had been no rain, so it wasn't like it could have been the sound of something shifting. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or something else trying to get into the cabin. I stood up and walked to the door, not feeling too nervous, more curious than anything. I opened the door to find nothing. The porch light flickered, casting a faint glow on the snow-covered ground, but there was no one in sight. The air was still, and there wasn't even the faintest sound of an animal nearby. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it, then shook my head, thinking I must have imagined it. After all, I was alone in the woods. It was easy to start overthinking things. But that wasn't the only strange thing to happen. A few days later, after I'd gotten into a bit of a routine, I started noticing something else. Footprints. They weren't mine, and I couldn't figure out who else would be out there. The closest neighbor was miles away, and they never came by. The prints were always fresh, though, like someone had been out there recently. I'd find them outside the cabin, leading to the porch, sometimes even stopping right at the door. Each time, I'd shake it off as another oddity, thinking maybe it was a deer or some other animal wandering around. But things escalated the night I woke up to the sound of something scraping at the walls of the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. I froze in bed, listening, trying to make sense of the sound. It was almost like someone or something was running their hands along the side of the cabin, just below the window. My heart raced as I held my breath, listening for any other sounds. The wind had picked up outside, but this noise was different. It was deliberate. Whoever or whatever was doing it was trying to get my attention. I lay there for what felt like hours, wide awake, trying not to make a sound, my mind racing with possibilities. Was someone out there? Person? I couldn't imagine anyone living that far out in these woods without a reason. And yet, I hadn't heard a single car pass by in days. There was no way anyone could have walked this far in the middle of the night without making noise, without the crunch of snow underfoot. Eventually, the noise stopped, but I didn't dare get up to check. I just stayed in bed, listening for any other sounds, but the night passed in silence. The next morning, when the light poured in through the small cabin window, I finally worked up the nerve to go outside. The snow had covered the area, and I could see no tracks near the walls. Nothing that could explain the scratching noise I'd heard. Days turned into weeks, and the unsettling feeling didn't go away. The footprints started appearing more regularly, and I noticed other signs. The woodpile near the back of the cabin had been disturbed. Logs were missing, and the stack wasn't as neat as it had been before. I couldn't remember moving any of them. And then, there were the strange noises that would come from the woods at night. Sometimes, I'd wake up to the sound of heavy breathing outside, followed by what sounded like slow, deliberate steps moving around the cabin. I would listen for a while, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than an animal, but every time it felt too deliberate, too human. One night, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The noises had been getting louder, closer, and I knew I couldn't just sit there anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly slipped out the back door, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The snow crunched underfoot as I made my way toward the edge of the woods, where the sounds seemed to come from. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of trees, casting long, eerie shadows on the snow. As I reached the edge of the woods, I stopped. There was something moving in the distance, just beyond the trees. At first, it was just a shadow, something large, dark, and out of place. It moved slowly, deliberately, and I felt my heart rate pick up. My first instinct was to turn and run back to the cabin, but I couldn't bring myself to. I stood there, staring into the blackness, wondering if I was imagining things. And then, there was a sound, a low, growling noise, almost like a warning. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion. I'd heard both of those animals before, and this sounded different. It sounded more human. The figure in the woods didn't move any closer, but I could feel its presence, like it was aware of me, studying me from the shadows. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. For what seemed like hours, I stood there, too afraid to move, too afraid to call out. Finally, the figure retreated into the woods, disappearing back into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I turned and ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I packed up my things. I didn't know if I had been imagining things, or if there was really someone or something out there, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. The cabin had become a prison of my own making, the solitude turning from peaceful to suffocating. I needed to leave before whatever it was found me. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The woods behind me seemed to watch me as I left, and I couldn't help but feel as if something was following me, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. When I finally reached the town, I stopped at a small cafe and tried to calm myself with a hot cup of coffee. The barista behind the counter gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. I knew I wasn't going back there. The cabin was someone else's problem now. Looking back, I can't help but think I was just a fool, thinking I could live out there alone without something, or someone, taking notice. But I'd made it out, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. The woods were no longer a place of calm, but a place of threat, and I wasn't sticking around to find out what came next. I'd been looking forward to a weekend away in a cabin, a place I could escape to. I needed some time alone, away from the noise of daily life, the city, and the constant buzz of people around me. The cabin was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, tucked away in the woods, about a couple of hours' drive from my home. It was far enough to feel isolated, but not too far to be inconvenient. When I arrived, I was greeted by a small, rustic cabin with a sloped roof and a porch that overlooked a small clearing surrounded by trees. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and the only sounds I could hear were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird in the distance. It was exactly what I needed. I unpacked my bags, made a small fire in the fire pit outside, and just sat there for a while, taking it all in. The cabin itself was simple but cozy. There was a living room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a loft bedroom. The floor creaked under my feet as I moved about, but it added to the charm. I settled in, ate some dinner, and spent the evening relaxing. There were no other cabins nearby, no one else around for miles. It felt like I was the only person on Earth. The first night passed without incident. I slept soundly, the soft crackling of the fire outside the cabin the only noise that filled the silence. But that was only the beginning. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I grabbed my jacket, some water, and a flashlight, just in case, and set out for a hike. The woods were dense, the trees towering overhead like silent giants. The path was narrow, and the forest floor was covered with a thick layer of fallen leaves. I had no particular destination in mind, just wanted to stretch my legs and enjoy the quiet. As I walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. The silence was almost oppressive, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot. After about an hour, I came across an old, abandoned shack hidden behind some overgrown bushes. It was small, barely standing, with broken windows and a door that hung crookedly on its hinges. My curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to check it out. I pushed the door open with a creak, stepping inside. The inside was damp and musty, the walls covered in mildew. A few pieces of old furniture, long since abandoned, lay scattered around. The air smelled stale, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I chalked it up to my imagination, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at me. I didn't stay long. On my way back to the cabin, the sun had begun to dip behind the trees, and the forest started to grow darker. I quickened my pace, eager to get back before it was too dark. But as I walked, I couldn't help but notice something strange. The sounds of the forest had stopped. No birds, no rustling of leaves, no animals scurrying through the underbrush. Just an eerie, oppressive silence. I dismissed it as nothing more than my mind playing tricks on me. But as the evening drew near, I began to feel a sense of unease. I chalked it up to the isolation, the quiet, the unfamiliarity of the place. I made it back to the cabin just as the last rays of daylight faded, and I quickly locked the door behind me. That night, I sat by the fire, trying to push away the odd feeling I couldn't quite shake. The wind picked up outside, causing the trees to sway and creak. I could hear the branches scraping against the walls of the cabin. The wind seemed to whisper, like it was trying to tell me something, but I brushed it off and settled down for the night. Around midnight, I was awoken by a loud bang from outside. It sounded like something heavy had struck the cabin. My heart jumped into my throat as I lay there, listening. The noise didn't come again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got out of bed and peered out the window, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the darkness. The forest was eerily quiet again. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I decided to go outside to investigate, though I had no real reason to believe something was out there. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch, the cold night air biting at my skin. The light from the flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness, but I scanned the area around the cabin, my pulse racing. Nothing seemed out of place. I checked the fire pit, making sure it was still out, then circled the cabin once before heading back inside. I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to calm my nerves. I had no reason to be scared, but something about the place was starting to feel wrong. I forced myself to go back to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made me jump. I lay there wide awake, listening to the sounds of the night. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard it again, a faint noise coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it happened again. A low, scraping sound, like something moving against the cabin walls. My stomach tightened, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I grabbed the flashlight again and crept out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood by the window, shining the light across the yard. There was nothing there, just the trees swaying in the wind. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just beyond the tree line, there was a figure, a man, or at least what looked like a man. He was standing perfectly still, just watching the cabin. I froze, unsure of what to do. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it someone from the nearby town? A hunter? A lost hiker? Or something else? The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge the light from the flashlight. He just stood there, facing the cabin, watching me. I quickly turned off the flashlight, hoping he hadn't seen me. My mind was racing, and I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. I couldn't just stay there. I needed to do something. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, far from any cell towers. Panic set in. I was alone, with no way to contact anyone. No one knew I was here. I had no choice but to stay inside, locked away, and hope whoever or whatever was out there would leave. But as I sat in the dark, every creak of the cabin felt louder. Every shadow felt like a threat. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I could still see the figure in my mind, standing in the darkness just beyond the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there, staring out the window, listening for any movement. But by morning, the figure was gone, and the forest was as quiet as ever. The sun rose, casting a warm glow over the woods, and the world felt normal again. But I knew that something wasn't right. The next day, I packed up my things and left. I didn't want to stay another night in that cabin. I didn't want to risk whatever had been watching me the night before. The drive back to town was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that someone was out there, lurking in the woods. I've never gone back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know I don't ever want to find out again. I had been living in the small cabin for about a week when the strange occurrences started. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a quiet weekend getaway in the middle of nowhere. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The peace of the place had been exactly what I was looking for. a break from the noise and chaos of city life. I had planned to spend my time fishing in the nearby lake, hiking the trails, and maybe reading a book by the fire at night. It was the perfect retreat. The cabin itself was old but solid, with wooden walls that creaked when the wind blew. I had rented it through an online site, and from the photos it looked charming enough, the kind of place people would describe as rustic. There was no electricity, just a generator outside that powered a few lights and a small fridge. I wasn't bothered by the lack of modern conveniences. It added to the charm, I thought. The closest neighbors were miles away, so I felt completely alone out here, which was exactly what I wanted. On the first few days, I spent my time enjoying the natural beauty of the area. The forest was dense with towering pines, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and pine needles. The lake, a half-mile from the cabin, was calm and serene, like something out of a postcard. I made a fire every night, cooked simple meals, and watched the stars from the porch. It was the kind of peaceful solitude I'd been craving. But then, one evening, everything changed. I was sitting on the porch, a blanket around my shoulders, staring into the crackling fire when I heard it, the sound of something moving in the woods. At first, it wasn't anything strange. I thought it was probably a deer or maybe a fox, but the sound was too heavy, too deliberate. The branches didn't sway the way they should have, and the ground didn't creak under the weight of a small animal. This was different, like something larger was moving through the woods, something that shouldn't have been there. I had heard animals before, but this felt wrong, out of place. I stood up, grabbing the flashlight from the cabin's door, and walked a little way into the trees. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, and I could see the shadows of the trees stretching out, their bark glinting in the light. The noise stopped as soon as I moved, and I couldn't see anything in the woods that would explain it. But then, I heard it again, closer this time. A rustling, a low crunching sound, like something heavy walking through the underbrush. My heart began to race, and I froze. It wasn't like the sound of an animal. It sounded almost human, but not quite. It was too heavy, too unnatural, as though whatever it was dragging its feet. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe it was a bear, or maybe someone was messing with me. But I quickly dismissed the idea. No one else was supposed to be out here. The closest road was miles away, and there were no other cabins nearby. I decided to walk back to the cabin, but before I could turn, I heard it again, closer. This time, the sound wasn't just rustling leaves. It was a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a grunt. My stomach twisted. I knew something wasn't right. I stood there, staring into the darkness, waiting for any sign of movement. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, I saw two glowing eyes reflecting the light of my flashlight. They were unnaturally bright, and they didn't move. They just stared at me from the shadows. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. The thing didn't move, but those eyes. They were watching me, studying me, almost as if it was deciding whether or not to come closer. My pulse quickened, and I took a step backward, trying not to make a sound. I don't know how long I stood there, but after what felt like an eternity, the eyes slowly disappeared into the shadows. The rustling in the woods stopped. I stood frozen, the flashlight trembling in my hands, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It didn't look like an animal, and it didn't look like a person either. I couldn't explain it. I had been in the woods enough times to know how to tell the difference between the normal creatures that lived here and something else. This was something else. After what felt like hours, I reluctantly made my way back to the cabin, my footsteps quick and unsteady. I locked the door behind me and sat in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was probably just a trick of the light or maybe some weird reflection. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That feeling, the one in my gut that told me something was wrong, wouldn't go away. My thoughts raced as I tried to convince myself that I had just imagined it. But I knew better. The thing in the woods wasn't something my mind could have made up. I spent the rest of the night with the lights on, sitting by the fire, trying to ignore the noise outside. But every now and then, I would hear something. a branch breaking or the soft padding of footsteps in the underbrush. I kept the flashlight beside me, hoping it would be enough to protect me if whatever it was decided to come closer. The next day, I decided to leave. I didn't want to be there anymore. I packed up my things, but as I was about to head out, something caught my eye in the distance, near the edge of the forest. It was hard to make out, but there was something standing there. Something large and dark, almost blending into the trees. It was far enough away that I couldn't get a clear view, but I could make out its shape. A strange, hunched figure standing perfectly still, watching me. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I felt a cold chill spread through my body. The thing's eyes were glowing again, and for a brief moment, I thought I could see its face. It was wrong. Its face wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. It was a twisted, almost animalistic expression, with a snout that seemed too long, and its teeth, sharp and white, stuck out from its mouth. The figure was tall, much taller than any man, and its body was covered in thick, matted fur. I didn't wait to see more. I grabbed my bag, bolted out the door, and sped away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't look back. I couldn't get the image of those eyes, the twisted figure in the woods, out of my mind. Even now, as I'm writing this, I still don't know what it was. Some people might call it a dogman, others might think it was just a bear or some other animal, but I know what I saw. There's no mistaking it. And I'll never forget those eyes, glowing in the dark, watching me. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from everything. I had rented this little cabin out in the middle of nowhere, far from any town or busy road. Just me, a few supplies, and nature. I thought it would be the perfect way to escape the stress of work and life. I wanted peace, quiet, and time to think. But that's not what I got. I arrived on a Friday evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The cabin was small but cozy, nestled in a small valley surrounded by tall pine trees. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird calling from the trees. I unpacked my car, grabbed the small cooler of food, and carried it inside. There was something comforting about being away from everything, like I was in my own little world. I figured I'd settle in, start a fire, and enjoy a quiet evening alone. The cabin was rustic but nice, with a wood stove in the corner and a few mismatched pieces of furniture. There were 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a bathroom, nothing extravagant but more than enough for what I needed. The place had a nice, earthy smell, the kind you get from old wood and fire. I spent a few hours unpacking, getting a fire going in the stove, and arranging things just right. As the evening wore on, I felt more and more relaxed. I ate my dinner in the dim glow of the firelight, the only sound being the occasional crackle of the burning wood. I had no internet, no cell service, and no distractions. Just me and the cabin. As the night deepened, I settled into the couch, wrapped in a blanket, and read a book. It was around 10:30 when I first heard it. A soft scratching sound, almost like something scraping along the wood. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it was just the wind or maybe a branch brushing against the cabin. But then it happened again. A slow, deliberate scrape. This time, it felt closer. My heart started to race, and I stood up to check the windows, but everything looked fine outside. The night was still and dark, the trees barely moving in the light breeze. I sat back down, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just an animal. There were plenty of raccoons and other creatures around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The scratching stopped for a while, but then, just as I started to relax, it came again. This time, it was louder, sharper, like something was trying to get inside. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood up and went to the door, peering out into the dark, but I couldn't see anything. No movement, no animals, just the dark outline of the trees against the starry sky. I locked the door and closed the blinds, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I went back to the couch, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. But the scratching came again, closer this time. I could hear it at the base of the door, right at my feet. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Animals didn't make sounds like that. It sounded too deliberate, like something trying to break in. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and slowly moved toward the door, my hands trembling. I knelt down and shined the light through the crack beneath the door. My pulse quickened as I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were marks, deep gouges, as if something had been trying to claw its way through the wood. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe a bear? But why would it be trying to get inside? I backed away from the door, my mind spinning with possibilities. I didn't know what to do. Should I leave? The idea of walking through the dark woods with no flashlight and no way to defend myself was terrifying. But I also didn't want to stay in the cabin alone with whatever was out there. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. I was completely isolated. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife from the drawer, and held it tightly in my hand. It was the only weapon I had. I sat in the corner of the living room, my back pressed against the wall, my eyes constantly darting to the door. The scratching stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Every little noise made my heart skip a beat. The wind, the trees, my own breath. Time seemed to drag on. Minutes turned into hours, but nothing happened. No more scratching, no sounds from outside, no signs of movement. Eventually, I managed to convince myself that I was just overreacting. It was probably just some animal that wandered off. I slowly let my guard down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was like I was waiting for something to happen, even though I didn't want it to. I eventually decided to go to bed. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and crawled into bed, still clutching the knife. I told myself I was being silly, that nothing was going to happen, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the cabin made my heart race. Every gust of wind made me tense. I didn't dare close my eyes, afraid that if I did, I might miss something. But eventually, exhaustion won over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up the next morning with the light streaming in through the windows. The air was cool and fresh, and for a moment, I thought I had just imagined everything. It had been a long night, and I was exhausted. But as I got out of bed and went to make coffee, I froze in my tracks. The door, it was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it open. I was sure of that. I had locked it before bed. My heart began to pound in my chest as I moved cautiously toward the door. There were fresh marks on the wood, deeper and more pronounced than the ones I had seen the night before. Something or someone had been trying to get in. I quickly shut the door and locked it again, but my mind was racing. Who or what had been here? The idea of an animal seemed less likely now. There was no way a bear or raccoon could have made those marks. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and someone or something had been trying to get in. I knew I had to leave, but I didn't want to stay another night here, not after what had happened. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking as I threw my clothes and gear into my bag. I didn't care about the mess. I just wanted to get out. I stepped outside into the fresh morning air, the birds singing in the trees, but everything felt wrong. The world around me seemed too quiet. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, someone lurking just out of sight. The thought of walking through those woods, alone and vulnerable, made my stomach turn. I decided to head back to the car and leave. I moved quickly, almost running, but when I reached the trail leading to the parking area, I froze. There, just off the trail, I saw something that made my heart stop. It was a set of footprints, fresh, deep prints in the soft earth. They were too large to be from any animal I knew. They looked like human prints, but they didn't make any sense. They were wide, as if the person had been wearing boots too big for them, and they were heading in the direction of the cabin. I was shaking now, terrified beyond reason. Someone had been out here. Someone had been watching me. I turned and ran toward the car, jumping in and locking the doors the moment I was inside. I didn't care if I looked paranoid. I started the car and sped down the narrow dirt road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't look back until I was safely on the highway, miles away from the cabin. Only then did I allow myself to breathe again, my heart still racing in my chest. The silence in the cabin, the scratching at the door, the footprints in the dirt. They all came flooding back in a rush, and I knew, without a doubt, that I had narrowly avoided something much worse than a simple animal encounter. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been watching me, I was glad to be gone. I was alone at the cabin, sitting by the fire with the wind howling outside. The place was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the old wood, which had settled over the years. I'd rented the cabin for the weekend, looking for some solitude to clear my head. It was one of those little cabins out in the woods, the kind that had no electricity, no neighbors for miles, just a creak and the sound of the wind blowing through the trees. At first, it felt peaceful. I unpacked my bags, got the fire going, and made some dinner. The night fell quickly in the woods. As soon as the sun disappeared, the temperature dropped and the sky darkened completely. It was the kind of darkness that felt heavy, like it pressed down on you, making every sound seem louder and more intense. I wasn't used to being out here alone, but I told myself it was fine. I didn't need anyone. I was about to settle into my chair by the fire with a book when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, like a rustling, followed by a soft, almost inaudible growl. My ears perked up. I couldn't tell if it was just an animal in the woods or something else. The sound was odd, though too deliberate to be just the wind. I sat still, listening, trying to hear if it came again. The wind picked up, and the rustling outside became louder, followed by more growling. This time, I felt a shiver run through me. My gut told me something wasn't right. I tried to push it aside, chalking it up to some animal in the woods, maybe a bear or a wolf. But then the growl came again, closer this time, much closer. I stood up from my chair, walking cautiously to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. I didn't see anything at first. The trees were thick, and the shadows were long in the moonlight. But then I saw movement. Something was out there. It was hard to make out, but it was large. Too large for a normal dog. I squinted, trying to get a better look. Then it stepped into a patch of moonlight. It wasn't a bear, and it definitely wasn't a wolf. This thing had long, gangly limbs, and it was walking on 2 legs, not 4. Its face was snout-like, with sharp teeth glinting in the light. It was covered in matted fur, but its body had a twisted, almost human shape to it. The thing was standing up straight, its head swiveling back and forth like it was sniffing the air, searching for something. My heart raced, and I quickly pulled the curtain shut, hoping it hadn't seen me. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. What the hell was that? Couldn't be real. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was probably just some animal I wasn't familiar with. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. No animal I knew walked like that. No animal had that face. I sat back down by the fire, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. I heard it again, the growl, much louder this time. I could feel the vibrations in the floorboards as the thing circled the cabin. It was right outside. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Every instinct in me was screaming to run, to get out of there. But I couldn't. For what felt like hours, it stayed out there, pacing around the cabin. The growls grew more frequent, more intense. It was getting closer to the door now, and I could hear its claws scraping against the wood. I could almost feel its breath through the walls, hot and heavy. My palms were sweating, and my breath came in quick, shallow gasps. Then, without warning, the door rattled. Something had slammed into it from the outside. I jumped up, my heart pounding in my chest. The thing was trying to get in. I could hear it sniffing at the door, its claws tapping against the wood. I scrambled around the cabin, looking for anything to defend myself with. I grabbed a heavy flashlight, but I knew it wouldn't do much against whatever that thing was. I tried to calm my breathing, telling myself that I just needed to make it through the night. The door shook again, harder this time. Whatever it was trying to force its way in. I ran to the window again, peeking through the curtain just enough to see. The thing was pacing back and forth right outside, watching. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the firelight. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a wolf. It was something else entirely. The minutes dragged on. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window. Every noise outside made my stomach twist in fear. I had no idea what to do. The only thing I could think was that I had to make it through the night. I couldn't leave the cabin, and I couldn't stay inside and let it get to me. I was trapped, isolated, and terrified. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the growling stopped. Everything went silent. I stood frozen, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that it was still out there. But there was nothing. The silence was deafening. I waited for what felt like hours, not daring to move, not daring to breathe too loudly. I couldn't tell if it was gone or if it was just waiting for me to make a mistake. The air felt thick with tension, and the fire crackled as if mocking my fear. I kept glancing at the door, expecting it to rattle again at any moment. Eventually, the sun started to rise, its light creeping through the cracks in the cabin's walls. It felt like a lifetime since I'd first heard the growl, but it had only been a few hours. I didn't know what time it was, but I knew that daylight had come, and that meant the thing outside was probably gone. I cautiously approached the door, my eyes scanning every inch of the surrounding woods through the window. Everything was quiet. I finally took a breath, my shoulders sagging with relief. It was over. I stayed inside the cabin for the rest of the day, not daring to go outside. I didn't know what that thing had been, but I wasn't about to find out. It was only after the sun had fully set again that I finally worked up the courage to leave. I didn't bother packing up my things. I just grabbed what I could and left. I made it back to my car and didn't stop driving until I was back in town. I never went back to that cabin. I never even drove near the woods again. I couldn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy. They'd tell me it was just a bear or a coyote. But I knew what I saw. I knew what was out there, and I knew I was lucky to make it out alive. That night changed me. I stopped looking for peace in places like that cabin. Instead, I found solace in the comfort of people, in the buzz of a busy city, where the only growls I'd hear were from the streets, not from the woods. I learned the hard way that sometimes there are things out there that we just don't understand, and that's a lesson I'll never forget.